Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here today for our webinar about what journalists need to know to improve their coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Mallory Tenori, Associate Director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication, and I'm so delighted that you're here with us today. More than 2,000 people from around the world are joining us for this webinar, which is being organized by the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas in partnership with UNESCO and funded by the World Health Organization and UNESCO's multi-donor program on freedom of expression and safety of journalists. The webinar will be held in English with simultaneous interpretations into Arabic, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. You can listen to it in any of these languages by clicking the interpretation icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and selecting your preferred language. We're holding today's webinar because we believe in the importance of high-quality journalism that illuminates the truth and helps people make more informed decisions. And so we've brought together a terrific lineup of speakers, including journalists, researchers, and medical experts, to share insights that will help you navigate the latest COVID-19 developments. Today's speakers will offer global context for journalists who are covering COVID-19 vaccines, medications, variants, and mutations. They'll also discuss the ever-evolving data surrounding the virus and how to combat disinformation. We hope you'll come away from today's webinar with a greater understanding of these issues and with ideas about how to implement what you've learned into your COVID-19 coverage now and in the months ahead. With all that said, I'd like to turn the conversation over to my esteemed colleague, Rosenthal Alves, the director and founder of the Knight Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory. As a UNESCO chair in communication and founding director of the Knight Center, I'm honored and grateful for this opportunity to work once again with UNESCO and WHO to offer another program to help journalists around the world interested in improving their coverage of COVID-19. Just a few days after the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak a global pandemic in 2020, we started immediately conversations with UNESCO, WHO, and UNDP to find ways to assist journalists who suddenly had to cover a complex and huge health issue. A few weeks later, we offered our first massive open online course, a MOOC, in 4 languages that reached 9,000 people in 162 countries and territories in May 2020. Since then, we have reached thousands of journalists again with other MOOCs and another multilingual webinar like this one offered exactly 1 year ago. Those programs are offered live or for a period of time, but are later repacked, translated to many more languages and made available on our website, journalismcourses.org. They can be accessed at any time from anywhere in the world. In partnership with UNESCO and funding from the European Union, we are currently upgrading our website section called COVID-19 courses and resources. And the redesign will be open very soon. Thanks, Gabriela. Thanks, Guilherme. Thanks to Deborah Blum, our moderator, and all the speakers and attendees from around the world. So let's start our great webinar. I pass now to Guilherme Canella from UNESCO.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Rosenthal, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people from all over the world. Let me just repeat what Rosenthal said, how this all started, and I will tell really the teaching of this. It was early March, just after, as Rosenthal said, the global pandemic was announced, and I was in my apartment in Paris, 5:30 a.m. in the morning. And Rosenthal was late evening in Austin and called me and saying, we need to do something to help journalists to navigate this story. And I told him, yes, what we should do. Let's do that now. Let's do this, what you do best, MOOC. But we need to involve other partners. We need to talk to my colleagues from the World Health Organization. And later on, we also involved the UNDP and the European Union. And I provoked Rosenthal that we should do these things in several languages. And initially, he was a little bit skeptical. But at the end, as he just said, we did it. And 2 years later, more than 30,000 journalists, fact checkers, and communicators were involved in many ways with this initiative. And this is not our merit. I think there was this willingness, there was this openness from the journalist community, from the fact checkers community to really engage in this important and very, very difficult challenge to provide accurate information in this massive wave of disinformation and misinformation that we experienced in these last 2 years. And we saw that journalism, good journalism, was essential to save lives. And indeed, they were saved. And I guess that the acknowledgement or the recognition for journalism, but particularly for Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, with the Nobel Peace Prize last December, is just another sign of the global relevance of accurate information for peace, for fighting sanitary crisis, for addressing the big issues of climate change or elections or democracy and so on and so forth. So even if the pandemic stopped it tomorrow, what you are going to discuss today is still relevant, is relevant to fight disinformation in natural disasters, in other epidemics and pandemics that will come, unfortunately, to address issues, as I said, of climate change or migration or elections. So we as UNESCO are very, very proud of this initiative, proud to partner with our chair in the Knight Center in Texas University, to partner with other UN organizations, and especially with our dear colleagues of the World Health Organization. Therefore, I have the pleasure to now hand the floor to my dear colleague, Gabriela Stern. She is the Director of Global Communications in WHO. So, Gabi, over to you.
Thank you so much, and Rosenthal and Mallory and everybody. So in my remarks, I'm going to propose questions that I think reporters should ask themselves when covering matters of gravity, whether threats to global health or threats to democracies or really any other subject or theme. These are things I've been thinking about during the pandemic in my communications role in global health, but also as someone who was a reporter and editor for around 40 years. And frankly, I'm ashamed to say that I was something of a byline hound who should have had more humility and self-awareness and worked harder to really understand and thus truly enlighten readers in more of my coverage. So these questions that I'm going to run through are as much to my younger self as they are to all of you who are in the field right now. Here goes. Question. Is this story worth pursuing and publishing ASAP? Or am I rushing to get something out because I feel pressured to produce copy and get bylines, or because another news outlet had it and I and my editors want to match it? Am I on a quest to find a specific type of conflict or failure, a piece that will feel like a quick expose, rather than entering into the reporting process with eyes and intellect wide open to what I might find or not find? Is this situation real and important, or am I buying into the framing of a source or sources who are acting in bad faith and who may be using me to embarrass or harm the people I'm covering? Do I have true understanding of the power dynamics and incentive structures which are at work here in terms of my role and relationship with my sources, as well as the people I'm covering? Have I spent enough time and brainpower coming to understand the people I'm covering beyond their public utterances and other easy things to get? Have I put the hard work in to get behind the scenes, inside the meeting rooms and corridors, to understand who's zooming who, to quote Aretha Franklin? Have I spent the time needed to understand the roles, governance structures, legal authorities, leverage, or constraints that empower or limit the people and institutions I'm covering? When I write a piece saying that someone has failed at a task, or that there's a conflict, or some such, am I really sure that this person has the authority to do what they're being criticized for? Fundamentally, it's about power. Are you, as a journalist, aware and respectful of your power? Are you conscious of the power of your sources over you? Do you understand the power or lack thereof of the people and organizations you're covering? Bottom line, are you moving too fast? Are you digging deeply enough? Are you keeping your mind and heart open? All of these are questions I failed to ask myself over decades of covering politicians, CEOs, corporations, government agencies, and more. And these are questions that not enough reporters ask themselves in the current era, during the pandemic, during political crises, and so on. And as a result, I feel there are too many stories that seem very buzzy and cool, but are sometimes just cheap and cheerful scooplets. And sometimes these kind of cheap and cheerful scooplets send reporters down unimportant and even harmful rabbit holes, when you could really be making genuinely valuable contributions to a world in distress. So these are questions to my younger self and questions to you, and I hope they're useful. And email me if you ever want a copy of them, sterng@who.int. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Really appreciate your remarks and your support. Huge thanks to you and Guilherme and to UNESCO and the World Health Organization for your ongoing partnership and support of our different COVID-19 activities. So to those of you in the audience, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And so you can click on the little interpretation globe in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language. Also want to let everyone know that we are streaming this webinar to YouTube, and we will post the YouTube links in the chat. So if at any point you have technical difficulties with Zoom, you can always tune in via YouTube. I'd now like to turn our attention to our first panel of the day and introduce today's moderator, Deborah Blum. Deborah is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, columnist, and author, and she's the director of the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT. She will kick off our first panel and introduce our panelists, a terrific group of science and health journalists from around the world. Together, they'll discuss the challenges associated with the inequitable distribution of information and ever-evolving data surrounding COVID-19. We'll be taking questions at the end of this panel, so please do post your questions in the Zoom chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. With all that said, I'd like to turn it over to Deborah. Welcome.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be moderating this terrific panel. And I want to briefly introduce each of them. We have Davey Alba coming to us from the United States, Mandy Smallhorn from South Africa, Federico Kukso from Argentina, and Jane Chu from China. Our topic is disinformation. I want to introduce that by just pointing out that a cartoon has been circulating here in the United States, which adds one horseman to the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So that the cartoon is death, war, famine, conquest, and disinformation. And that should tell you how seriously we need to be taking that in the pandemic. I want to start by asking Davey Alba, who specializes in reporting on disinformation at the New York Times, your assessment of what seems to be driving this particular wave of disinformation that we've seen exploding across the landscape in COVID-19.
So thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I cover disinformation for the New York Times, and over the past couple years, there, as Deborah has mentioned, has been an explosion in misinformation about everything, but especially this pandemic. And in covering this beat, one thing that I've really internalized and realized is that misinformation is very much follows the news cycle, follows whatever is the hot topic of the day. And so with COVID-19 being relevant for millions of people around the world, it's a global pandemic. This is something that misinformers have latched onto and can make a quick buck of, can make a name out of, by spreading incorrect information and playing to their bases. So this is a serious problem, and we should all be aware and sort of think about solutions.
Agreed. And I want to move now to Mandy. Mandy, there's been a new wave of disinformation following the rise of the Omicron variant, which was reported first very clearly and transparently in South Africa. Could you address what you think are some of the reasons why we're seeing this response to Omicron in this unfortunate way?
I think that hi everybody. I think that one of the reasons why we've had a wave of misinformation around Omicron is in fact the difference of the experience in South Africa. Omicron hit us at a time where we were already at a low, where we had not had great vaccination figures, but through the disastrous Delta wave, apparently a lot of our people, up to 70%, had actually been exposed to COVID. So that when Omicron hit us, it didn't hit nearly as hard as it might have in other countries in the world. And so there was this story, this narrative that arose that Omicron was mild, nothing to worry about. And unfortunately, that has spread far and wide and has contributed to poor response, I think, even poor policy around tackling Omicron.
That's an excellent point. Federico, earlier when you and I were talking, you talked about this sort of new wave of mistrust in institutions, pharmaceutical companies, governments in Latin America. And I wonder if you could talk again, since we're looking at this sort of very recent rise in disinformation, what you think lies behind that. And if Federico is not able to do this right at the moment, Federico, could you address the sort of factors behind the rise of disinformation and also mistrust? Because I think they're linked together, right? People respond to misinformation when they already distrust the system in some way or distrust authorities. Do you see that in Latin America? I am having a hard time hearing you. Let's see if the Veritas folks can adjust your microphone. And while they're doing that, Federico, I'm going to jump over to Jane. Jane, you have spent a lot of time meticulously looking at one aspect, not that you haven't covered other aspects of COVID-19, but meticulously looking at some of the stories that have surrounded the lab leak theory. And in this particular case, one of the drivers of disinformation seems to be government, the American government, the Chinese government. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, the role of government, speaking of sources that we tend to lose trust in, in driving very alternative stories of the origins of COVID-19.
Right. Yes. So I've been covering the origins of COVID since the pandemic, and more intensely in the past year. So it really is a battle of the narratives between two fiercely competing theories. On one hand, you have the natural origins theory. On the other, you have the lab leak theory, and now I truly appreciate why people say that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. As you mentioned, an important driver of this misinformation in this debate are the Chinese and U.S. governments. They were engaging in this disinformation campaigns. It's like watching two kids in a shouting match, with each trying to outcompete the other to come up with the most outlandish claim. So, China's foreign ministry, for instance, insinuated that the virus was leaked from a military lab near Maryland, and Tom Cotton, a U.S. senator, said that the virus was engineered by the Wuhan lab and then leaked. There are also more insidious forms of such campaigns. Some U.S. officials, for instance, they would talk to political reporters anonymously about their speculation of lab leak, and then these unverified claims would be splashed across the media, often presented as evidence for lab leak. So that's a major issue, is that people tend to confuse between speculation with evidence. So it's a big problem.
That's an excellent point too. And returning to you, Federico, do you think issues, the kind of scenario that Jane is raising, really speaks to the problem of all of us starting to lose faith in honest sharing of information from our governments? And do you see that in Latin America? Do you see a rise in mistrust in institutions? Do you have a quick idea of what might drive that in your part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, Latin America, as you know, not an homogeneous continent. I mean, there you got Brazil, you have Argentina, you have Chile, but one thing is that you can understand the pandemic or the science journalism with noticing how the history of science in the region. Science hasn't been the central part of the agendas of the government. You don't see many science journalists in the newspaper, not because there are not science journalists, mostly because newspapers, usually they don't hire science journalists, and science is not a big part of the agenda of the newspapers. So I think you have to understand that, and the mistrust with the government related to other issues like ecological issues or political or economical issues. So I think that that's a part of the problem. But also I think there are many problems. For example, one of the problems I see in the coverage of the pandemic that many people usually don't talk about is the hype. How some information had been exaggerated related to some drugs or treatments or even vaccines, right? So I think that's a problem in the media landscape, mostly because you saw this in Latin America regarding convalescent plasma. You saw this with hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, or even vaccines. Many, last month when there started to be a lot of breakthrough infection here in Latin America, many people start saying that the vaccines are not working, mostly because the news media usually tend to describe vaccines are this shield that covers you from virus. So I think it's important for my recommendation for journalists is try to be more moderate regarding the information you give. Try to and especially taking into account that behind press releases are big companies, and you have to take that into account. Try to be try not to exaggerate. We all know, we all want to listen or to read some news that says that some drug or some treatment will end this pandemic forever. But I think it's at the end is end up eroding the confidence of the people in science. So I think as a journalist, we must be a little more ground to earth, try to be more moderate, and not exaggerate things.
Yes, I 100% agree with you about overselling research results and overstating vaccines. And in fact, we've seen that in this country as well, where people talk about breakthrough infections as if they're a failure of the vaccine, clearly showing that they really don't understand that vaccines are to, lower your chances of getting the virus, but also reduce your chances of serious illness. And Davey, I wonder, as you look at what I think of as fertile audiences for disinformation, right? There's so many things that I see, being generated out of the anti-vaccine machinery that I think, how could anyone believe that, right?
Yeah.
So do we have an understanding of who falls for specific? Can we characterize who actually is most vulnerable to these tactics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a technology reporter and I cover disinformation, especially online disinformation. And what we've seen in the past couple of years, for as long as this pandemic has been going on, is the internet is really an accelerant of these falsehoods that are spread and latch on to social media algorithms that prioritize the pieces of content that grab our attention the most and keep us entertained and following the thread, following the rabbit hole all the way down to its end of conspiracy theories that don't actually have a basis in fact. So, it's actually really troubling to me as a reporter looking at disinformation every single day that, the way this spills over into the public is really through the mainstream platforms. Some theories might start on more fringe platforms like Telegram and Parler and all these other alternative platforms like Rumble, the video platform. And then you see some people sort of raising these questions of, well, what if this is a legitimate theory? And people pick it up on Twitter and Facebook, and then it ends up in, your mom's feed or an uncle's feed, and people just sort of parrot and repeat what they see. So I think that that's a real problem here. And I'm not sure that there is actually really any one sort of archetype of someone who is particularly vulnerable to misinformation. I think that it's sort of incumbent on all of us to think of it as a project, a community project, to raise all of our literacy levels and to make sure that everyone that we are in contact with knows how to, sort of suss out good sources for themselves, and just to be aware of what's floating around there, which is partly my job, to be able to sort of respond to it when it comes up in conversation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to bounce back to you, Mandy, in this way. When I was listening to Davey, I was thinking about, I have a fairly distant relative who buys into all the anti-vax stuff, but she also brings to it an attitude, which is she doesn't like smart people, right? That's what she calls them, smart people, people who are overeducated and make her feel stupid. So she doesn't want to listen to them. She preferentially will choose these other sort of aspects of information. And I'm wondering if you see in South Africa, but just asking you to open that up to maybe even elsewhere in Africa, an attitude of mistrust in science based on both, let's say, past colonial behavior, but also, say, the actions of some of the big pharma companies or other governments that tends to bolster the response to misinformation. And if you think there's anything journalists can do about that.
Yes, I do think that there's a connection there. I noticed that we were getting disinformation feeding through to us, bleeding through to us from the US, which to me was the epicenter of disinformation. And it was colliding with existing problems in Africa, which I find very justifiable, actually. African populations have been used for drug trials over the years, often without necessary safeguards such as proper informed consent. And that has led to a whole lot of stories down the years, from polio vaccines to HIV, that circulate in our communities and inform people that, you know, Western science isn't necessarily to be trusted. And then along comes all this stuff coming in from America. And I think that the lesson that I certainly have learned as a journalist in this period, and that I think that we should all learn, is not to look at people and go, oh, you are a bunch of idiots because you believe this stuff. But to look at them and say, what makes you believe this? What is this feeding? Why don't you like smart people? What is in your history and your background that makes smart people so rebarbative? What is in a Kenyan's background that makes him feel less trusting of medical science? Are you afraid of having power taken away from you? Do you have really, I mean, I have some very seriously justified problems with Big Pharma. And I have to weigh that up every time I report, because there's bad and there's good, you know, and you need as a journalist to be able to tease that out. I think that it's really important for us. I started to learn it with climate change, you know, with all the disinformation around climate change and following those narratives. And now with COVID, it's become very clear to me that we have got to start thinking about different ways of communicating. We have to start storytelling, not just the facts, but also the feelings, the reasons for people's fears. Why are people so afraid that government might have played a part in creating this, whether it's the US or the Chinese government, doesn't matter. What is it about that narrative that feeds something inside them? Why are people so willing to believe ridiculous nonsense about the vaccines, for instance? I mean, I've just dealt with an adverse reaction story that was being touted by somebody who is a very, very educated person. You know, it's not about facts so much as what's in that person's mind, what's in their heart, that this info is feeding, and deal with that as well as the facts.
Yes. You know, I love this panel. I wish we could do it. I know you guys don't have time for the entire day because it raises so many interesting questions. Jane, when we're looking at sort of the biases of, I'm sorry, biases or attitudes or perspectives or beliefs of our readers, do we also need to consider the same with, and I'm thinking about the way journalists respond to, you know, information that may or may not be trustworthy, the biases or background of our sources and even our own perspective?
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Okay. Yes. Yes. I think especially when covering, you know, intensely political and intensely geopolitical stories, it's really important to vet potential bias. So, you know, as you mentioned, you know, I think, you know, we all have our own bias as well. You know, we are all humans. We all have opinions. So I think the first thing is really to acknowledge and to be honest about our own potential bias. You know, it's the first step to keep it in check. I'm going to have, you know, a major story out on COVID origin, and so it you know, I was really worried, you know, about my own potential bias, because, you know, story has a angle of geopolitics, you know, the China-US tension. So I just kept asking myself, am I being objective? Am I letting my own opinion, my own sentiment affecting, the balance of the article? I was so worried. Actually, I sent an early draft to a top US journalist, a dear friend of mine. I actually consider her as my mentor. I sent her an early copy for her to check whether the article is biased. So of course the sources also have potential bias. We need to ask, does this person has an axe to grind? Does this person has an agenda to push? A top US journalist told me about his experience interviewing a strong proponent of lab leak theory. And he told me that the source is really, really angry with China. And he said, I quote, his anger towards China blinds him to the facts, end of quote. So, when we come across sources like that, when we are aware that, he's potentially very biased, we need to be really careful, how to treat, the material we got from him, how to treat the assertions we have from them. So I think a golden rule is really, in journalism, is that the fact somebody says something to us, does not necessarily mean that we should use it in our story without critical assessment. We are not brainless. We are not brainless transcription apps. There's always a judgment call in everything we put into our story, and critical assessment of the assertions, to assess the evidence behind the assertions is incredibly important, especially, covering, stories with geopolitical political angles.
Yes, absolutely right. Davey, I want to come back to you for a minute in this sense. We've had a lot of discussion about the rise of disinformation and some of the factors that sort of amplify it. I cited the cartoon that's been circulating in my science journalism circles of disinformation being the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, which, the idea behind that is the disinformation is doing actual harm, costing lives. But do we know that that's true? Do we have any way to assess whether all of these different forces that push people to a misunderstanding of what the pandemic is actually causing harm, is actually causing lives? Could you explore that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So since I'm on a panel of science journalists, I want to be careful about attributing a causal connection to these things. It is really hard to say one thing causes another without a controlled study and lots of years of research. But what we do know and what we do have data on is just how far these lies spread. And there are different ways to track that data. I use various platforms like CrowdTangle. I am, in touch with research companies all the time to just give us a sense of the size of the lie and how far it's spread and who is sort of the purveyors of these lies. And you start to see repeat offenders and patterns and things like that. So one thing that we can say with a lot of certainty is that these lies spread so far. The most viral Facebook falsehoods regularly get tens of thousands of shares and millions of views. YouTube videos are in the tens of millions of views when it comes to like really viral stuff. For instance, Plandemic, if you guys remember that from 2020. And so we know that these things go viral. We know that they find an audience. We know that they reach enormous amounts of people. And we also know on sort of the more anecdotal track that when you see people coming into hospitals with COVID and refusing to get vaccines, that the things that they'll talk about are the lies that they see online. And so when you put those two side by side, there's really powerful anecdotal evidence that people are starting to believe and parrot some of these things that they hear online. And that is a factor in vaccine hesitancy. And that is something that every misinformation expert I've spoken to says.
And Federico, is there a responsibility of journalists to counter misinformation? Is that part of our job, or is our job to advocate for truth, as it were? Or is our job just to tell the story and hope for the best?
Well, I think one of the things, at least in Latin America, I think in other parts of the world, if you see that, try to find the responsibility behind the misinformation, it's not only on Facebook, it's not only on WhatsApp, it's also the misinformation also comes from the big media. For example, here in Argentina, there had been a big campaign against confinement at the beginning of the pandemic, mostly led by the big newspapers, mostly because their agenda collides with the agenda of the government. So for me, it's important that the news organization hire specialized journalists that have an experience dealing with a pandemic. The words are important. The words we use are important. So I think that's important for me, and also try to be more critical regarding science. One of the things that I've seen in Latin America, when a political journalist or a sport journalist interview a scientist, it's what is called epistemic trespassing. I don't know. I bet you already heard this expression. Is when a journalist interview a scientist that has an expertise in one field, but he usually gives opinion regarding an area that's outside that expertise. So for me, it's important to interview the correct people, mostly because sometimes they use the authority as scientists to promote like this. I don't know if you remember, there were many Italian scientists. I remember at April of 2020 that they said that the pandemic will end in 2 months. For me, it's a really funny experiment to go to the website of these newspapers, and you see all these fringe ideas at the beginning of the pandemic. Of course, we all know that science is a process, but sometimes I actually try to be more skeptic regarding scientists who wants to be in the media and have like these big declarations, like even if they are Nobel laureates. We don't have to rely on that. We have to rely on the evidence, not in the voice of the scientists. We as a journalist, we rely, where did it publish? Was it peer review? I don't care if you are a big scientist and you say that the virus is, I don't know, it doesn't exist, right? Like what happened with the HIV pandemic, right? So for me, that's a thing that we have to be more critical, even regarding our own news organizations.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. And I have a bunch more questions, actually, but we are getting a whole lot of questions from webinar participants. And so I'm going to shift over to those questions and ask you some of those. And I want to start with this one. This would bump back to you, Davey. Do you think that Facebook, although any of you can answer this, do you think Facebook, Google, and the other internet giants should play a bigger role in stopping misinformation? One of the big problems now is that journalists are also relying on these platforms to deliver the news. So there's some, sort of ethical tension there. And I'm curious as to what Davey and any of you think about that.
Yeah, I can give it a shot to begin with. I think that that's a really astute observation. Obviously, these platforms are now sort of distribution platforms as well for journalism. I think you always have to go back to the source of who is saying what and kind of analyze things that way. If it's a Facebook account of, a reputable news outlet, that obviously carries different weight than the personal account of a scientist who has a track record of spreading misinformation. And so, we always have to take those things into consideration. The thing that I'll say about the platforms is that they do sort of know that this problem exists, and they are aware of the stakes here. It's difficult because they always talk about having to balance free speech and making sure that everyone who wants to say something has the airtime and, all of this. At the same time, I do think that they have shown themselves to be quite late and sort of not aggressive enough in a lot of cases. And often the yardstick they'll use is if there is imminent harm. If there's imminent harm, then we may consider taking something off of our platforms. But sometimes that harm comes to pass. And, of course, it's always hindsight is 2020, but maybe there was something that we could have done to dampen these movements. January 6th, I think, of last year was the really big evidence of that speech can cause, sort of real world violence. It can spill over into the real world. And we really have to be careful about making sure that these movements, these huge movements that gain momentum online, don't snowball into these things that cause real world harm.
I just would like to add, if I may, Deborah,
Sure.
that it worries me how much of the delivery of news is affected by profit motives. You can see that with the platforms, you can see it with the media houses as well. And I don't know how to do it, but I think that we have to have some mechanism that counters that, because clickbait is driving everything at the moment.
Yeah, I agree that that's a problem.
To add to this is, at least in Latin America, there's a conflict of interest regarding Facebook, mostly because Facebook is funding many news organizations. So I don't see, as you, Debbie, said, a cause and effect, but you have to take into account that Facebook and Google are paying news organization, and it's important them to survive. Another thing, I don't know if you know this or what's the situation in China or in South Africa, that Twitter, for example, in Spanish, Twitter doesn't fight back the hate speech as they do in English. So you see in English, you can see like Trump and other political personalities that have been banned from this platform, and that's not the case with some politicals or like Bolsonaro or other big politicians that are against vaccines. So you have to take into account the language and the cultural diversities regarding these platforms.
That's true for isiZulu and Afrikaans as well, I can tell you. They're English. They're not looking at the other languages enough.
Do you
I
see
think that's
that as well, Jane? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to make the point that I think that's a huge problem of these platforms of scale where, we know that Facebook has all sorts of subsidies in developing countries so that they can sort of offer free Facebook, but only within Facebook, not, if you look up something on your cell phone, not on Facebook, it's outside of that gated wall and you have to pay a data fee for that sort of thing. And that's the danger of these social media companies trying to get as many users as possible, pushing into places that they don't understand the contexts of and don't have the resources, enough resources, especially local resources, to moderate content and understand deeply the consequences of letting something grow, some movement, some belief grow on that part of the world, and how it can affect communities.
Yeah. So in China, of course, the situation is quite different. So we don't have Twitter, we don't have Facebook. But we have our own social media platforms, like WeChat, like Weibo, which is a microblog. And so there are also lots of misinformation and sometimes can go viral. But as you all know, China has very strong machine to censor. And also they don't like anything go viral. So once they see some kind of virality, then they would kind of stamp down. Sometimes it's political, sometimes it's not. They just don't want this kind of, kind of a fame, the kind of kind of mass information going on in the internet. They just find it inherently threatening, so they just want to stand down. Sometimes there's no obvious reason, just people are sharing something quite benign, and then that can also be, I think that say something about maybe the kind of program, the software that they use to do the censorship. Sometimes it's not really it doesn't really work specifically for the ends of politics. Sometimes it's just random things get censored. Yeah.
And I'm against censorship, but we've had an ongoing debate in the US as to whether we should do more to regulate the big social media companies. And so far, it's been all talk and no action, which probably is also a money issue, right? I'm going to pivot a little here in our last few minutes. We have an ongoing discussion in science journalism about the problem of false balance. And so I should say that previous question, that very good question, was from Benice Balawan. And this one is from Nancy Brenner. How can journalists counterbalance anti-vax medical professionals, including doctors and nurses, in getting the story out correctly? Is there a false balance when we tip too much one way or the other here? Does anyone want to address that problem?
Maybe I can start. Yeah, Deborah.
Sure, go ahead.
I think So, for on the topic of COVID origins, there's quite a serious problem of false balance. We have two opposing theories. We have the natural origin theories. We have the lab leak theories. So in many articles, they are presented as if they were equally valid. Even scientifically, they are not. And, of course, both theories are possible. Nobody say that lab leak is not possible, but they are not equally likely. And at least at this moment, I researched about it intensely. My judgment is that the majority, the consensus lies to the natural origins. But I think the important thing about force balance or to avoid a force balance is that we have to convey very clearly where the scientific consensus lies and where the weight of different lines of evidence lies, and this have to be presented in a way that it's an ongoing process. It's not fixed conclusions, because consensus can be wrong. Things may change with new evidence, and the weighting of different lines of evidence can also change with new evidence. So it's an ongoing process, and people can change their mind, and then the science change. Yeah.
And I think that this is one of the things that is an important difference between a science journalist and a general journalist, a journalist who's trained out of the humanities usually, and they are rightfully trained to go and seek the other side. But when I do training on science journalism, that's one thing that I make very, very clear, is that in science, you have a consensus. In the settled science, you very often have a very clear consensus. In science like the COVID science, you can see the consensus developing, and you need to be sensitive to that as a reporter dealing with these issues. Is that John Oliver did such a good job of this with climate change, when he had 3 people in the studio dissenting from climate change, and then he had 97 people coming in to say this is the other point of view. This is the people who understand the consensus of science around climate change. We need to get that across somehow. Yes, there are dissenting views, but they are small in comparison to the major view. And we need to understand that while you need to sometimes reflect that there is another view, you don't need to give it the same weight as the consensus view. And I think that that's a really important thing that journalists need to understand, and that has been difficult for people put into a position in this pandemic of reporting on within this area of science. when they come out of an area where they've been taught completely differently in ethical terms with journalism, you've got to give the other side. I think that it's really important that we get that across, that in science there is very often a consensus, or a consensus is developing. And we need to be able to tell people that. We also need to convey that with an understanding of the uncertainties of science. That's one of the things that I've seen as problematic during this period, is that we kept on having reporting that said, this is what's happening, this is what's happening, instead of conveying carefully that science is an evolving process, especially in something like a pandemic.
Yes, and I think that should be a major goal for all of us who cover science. It's tricky because the news media is event driven and science is a process, and so we have that kind of culture class. But as we could do so much better if we could make people understand the sort of evolving nature of knowledge in this and many other cases. Again, pivoting, I have two questions, one from Priyanka Ranwai and from Lisa Palmer on a similar subject. How do you engage with when you get trolled? Social media trolling, outlandish opinions to your post when you're reporting on topics that are super hot, like the origin of COVID-19? And are you seeing a rise in digital attacks on your work in new ways, given the high profile that science reporting has had during the pandemic? Anyone want to start there with responding to trolling and attacks on honest reporting of science?
I don't know if I have an answer. I think in this, my opinion changed during the years I've been in social media. But I think one of the things is important, and we have to talk about this, is mental health of journalists. I usually get really mad when I attacked, and I end up blocking. I know this is not the best thing, but I think mental health is important, not only the medical staff, the scientists, or even all the population of the world is really burnt out with the pandemic, but also the journalists, right? We are every time we are breathing this information every way, every moment of the day, and even that we try to do our best, and then we end up being attacked. So I don't know if this is an answer, but I actually try to block to see who is attacking me, to see if I can have a conversation, something that is really hard in social networks, if I know this person, but I try to block them, mostly for my mental health, as I said before.
That's a good idea, an excellent idea. And the point about journalist mental health is also apt. Davey, do you think this is this is obviously not unique to science journalists, but do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do actually. And I want to tie in a little bit of the last question maybe into my answer. I think the way people have to think about balance, we also have to think about that very carefully when we decide to write about something as a misinformation reporter, because you don't want to give oxygen to falsehoods and allow them to spread further. So I think framing of stories and how you present this information is very important. So one thing that we'll do is make sure that this lie has already gotten traction on its own. It's already everywhere. And so our journalism isn't spreading it further. It's, providing the actual facts to talk about, hey, you may have seen this going around. Now let's talk about sort of what's actually the truth in this statement or piece of content, video, post, whatever. And so we want to make sure that something is already viral before we cover it, instead of adding to its momentum. And then secondly, and to do that, obviously you have to have the actual debunking up high. You can't just sort of let this person go on about their views before you start to pick it apart. And, on the flip side of that, with harassment, it's often people who have an enormous platform already, who have millions of followers, that end up covering. People who have a legitimate audience, who believe their lies. I cover a lot of big influencers in the anti-vax movement, much of right-wing media. And once you publish a story that says, hey, this is, these are lies, you do get a barrage of harassment coming your way. And it does get extremely loud. I've gone through harassment campaigns where on every single platform, my Twitter and Facebook and email and website and LinkedIn are getting inundated with messages. People find my Instagram account even and find, a way to DM me there. And sometimes it can get pretty personal and hit close to home, once they start to actually get into the project and dig into personal details of my life and people close to me. I think what Federico was saying about mental health is really, really important. And I have certain strategies to deal with that sort of thing at this point. Locking accounts down temporarily, sort of deciding when to not engage. And I think, the good thing is that these people tend to move on to the next lie and the next target. And so if you sort of keep your head down for a little bit, they will move on.
That's a great point, and also a great way to end this panel. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I just hate letting you guys go. There are so many other good questions that people have asked, ranging from the role of Bolsonaro in Brazil to looking at the world. What is, are journalists supposed to be educators? Are they supposed to be advocates? You sparked a great conversation among the attendees, and I want to say thank you to all of you for this really excellent conversation. And
Thank you.
Come back soon.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to echo Deborah and just thank each of you for this conversation. You've given us so much to think about when it comes to combating disinformation, minimizing harm, and disseminating truthful news and information. So I'm sure our attendees got a lot out of this conversation. Thank you. So in a minute, we're going to move to our next panel, which will deepen journalists' understanding of COVID-19 mutations and variants, along with the changeability of the virus. And Deborah Blum, our moderator, is going to introduce the panelists in a couple of minutes. And they each bring a high level of expertise to this topic. So this is a panel you won't want to miss. But before we turn our attention to that panel, I just want to make a few quick housekeeping notes. If you are just joining us, I want to let you know that we're streaming this webinar onto YouTube. So if at any point you have technical difficulties with Zoom, just go ahead and tune in via YouTube. And you can find those YouTube links in the Zoom chat. Also, this webinar is being held in 5 different languages. So if you would like to follow along in another language, just click on the interpretation globe in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language. And lastly, we do want to make this conversational, so I encourage you to post your questions to panelists in the Zoom chat, and we'll get to as many as possible. As always, your participation is really important to us. So now, without further ado, I would like to turn our attention to panel 2 and pass the conversation back over to Deborah, who will be moderating today's discussion.
Thank you, Mallory. And I'm excited also about this panel in which we look at the evolution of viruses and the emergence of variants and where we think this apparently endless pandemic is going. We hope it's not endless. We have an absolutely wonderful panel here. We have Angela Rasmussen from Canada, Purvi Parikh from the United States, and Kai Kupperschmidt from Germany joining us today. And thank you so much for being here, you all. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. And I want to start with Angie. Just talking a little bit about what we understand about, the way this pandemic has evolved, and by evolved, I mean the virus itself, right? So we started with one version of SARS-CoV-2 SARS-CoV-2. We've gone through a number of other iterations. We're in the Omicron moment at the moment, but we are seeing variations on Omicron itself. Could you talk a little bit about some of the factors that have sort of brought us to this point, and the way I am wondering if human behavior has influenced this viral evolution, Angie?
So that last question is a really, really difficult one to answer. Certainly humans have obviously influenced this virus's evolution. Behavior is a little different, because then you get into how is behavior contributing to transmission, which is really the scientific basis for the virus and the variants that we have circulating right now. I think one thing that I've observed throughout the pandemic, and it's been very interesting, because I'm an RNA virologist. To me, it's not surprising that if you take an RNA virus like SARS coronavirus 2 or any other RNA virus, and you let it basically run free in the population, you are going to get new variants evolving. But the way this is often covered is really credulous, and it's, oh my God, I can't believe we've got another new variant. I think that human behavior certainly comes into effect in the fact that we're all extremely tired of this pandemic, virologists included. And it's like, oh no, another variant. But it's not surprising. I guess I should say the things that are surprising about the variants, to me anyways, are not the things that are often shown in the press as surprising. So like, for example, it's not surprising that, again, if you have an RNA virus, which is going to mutate every time it replicates, and you have that spreading between millions, billions of people, you are going to get a number of new variants. The virus will continue to evolve and adapt for its host. In this case, that's the human population. But I think what is surprising to me is that every time we have a new variant emerge, people are still acting as though this is a surprising outcome, which again, it's not. The things that are surprising, specifically with Omicron, to me, are the fact that Omicron may have a bit of a different origin than some of the other variants of concern that have emerged. So alpha, beta, gamma, delta all emerged during unchecked transmission in largely unvaccinated populations. And that's not really the case with Omicron. So Omicron did emerge, or at least was first detected in South Africa, in a part of the world where the vaccination rate is overall low, but population immunity may still be high because they have had quite a bit of transmission in earlier waves caused by other variants. And evolutionarily, when you look at the genome of Omicron, it doesn't look like it evolved from viruses that were circulating recently in the human population. So there's really three hypotheses for where Omicron came from. One, that it was the result of long-term cryptic transmission in a population that's not being surveilled, meaning a population of people where it was spreading and it was not being detected by genomic surveillance and sequencing. Two, that it was the result of long-term infection or persistent infection of an immunocompromised person. And three, that it was the result of what's called a zooanthropogenic transmission or spillback, meaning it at some point spilled back into an animal population and then spilled over again into the human population. So right now we don't really know where Omicron came from, but it does appear to have somewhat of a different origin than the other variants of concern. Again, this isn't particularly surprising just when you think about the biology of RNA viruses. This virus in particular is a generalist. It can infect a number of different species. We would expect to see the virus continue to evolve and adapt to whatever host it's in. But this has emerged in a different way than the previous variants of concern. And the fact that we're still kind of talking about it as though, oh my God, it's such a surprise, this is a new variant. Well, we've had 4 other variants of concern, and there are many more variants of interest that have been identified. So I don't think it should be that surprising that we have new variants emerging. When it comes down to human behavior, I think the thing that we need to be focusing on, rather than, oh my God, new variant, is that our behavior is directly contributing to these variants emerging. And that means that we're not taking the proper precautions to reduce transmission. We're not making vaccines accessible to everybody in the world. We're not doing the things we need to be doing to reduce transmission, because that is what is going to reduce the emergence of new variants.
Yeah, those are excellent points, and I'm going to circle back to a number of them. I want to jump over to you, Purvi, and ask this. There's been a kind of mythology surrounding Omicron suggesting that, at least early on, that it was milder than some of the other variants. It's certainly, if you look at hospitalization and death rates in the United States, that's kind of hard to believe. Could you talk a little bit about what we know about whether this really is a milder variant, or is it more the current state of vaccination and previous exposures that makes it look that way, and whether and this just the whole interaction, so that we can have a more accurate idea of what you think is going on?
Right. No, those are all great questions. And, even the word mild sometimes makes me cringe, because I think it's the wrong word, right? Because it conveys the wrong message to the general public, that this is not something to be taken as seriously. And, kind of echoing what Dr. Rasmussen said, this is contributing to human behavior, right? Not taking those precautions in combination with the pandemic fatigue. But that being said, I'm a clinical immunologist, so I'm seeing this in patients, both in the hospital, out of the hospital. Even most of my research is clinical research. And what we're seeing is that, yes, that in some cases we are seeing quote unquote milder forms, meaning those who are vaccinated or even boosted, it's not progressing to the point where they're thankfully needing hospitalizations or ICU admissions, but that's not an absolute. Every day we're seeing people get admitted who were vaccinated, who were boosted, and even those quote unquote mild people in the outpatient realm, right, that are recovering at home. It's not a cold, and I'm speaking to people across all ages with all different medical problems. People are, knocked down by this, and not just for the time that they're infectious, but we're even seeing for weeks afterwards. And a particular interest of mine is long COVID, or the post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. And we know very well from previous variants that asymptomatic disease, mild disease, can still cause very debilitating long COVID syndromes, so that impact with Omicron, I'm also, kind of nervous to see. So when it is described as mild, at least from a clinical standpoint, that concerns me, and it's not meant to cause panic or worry, but we are seeing the crushing impacts on the hospital systems. And we're seeing that even if, let's say, the COVID-19 infection is not the primary reason for a hospitalization or an ICU visit, it's actually exacerbating their underlying condition. So we're seeing a lot of people coming in with their heart failure uncontrolled, or their diabetes uncontrolled, and it wouldn't have been uncontrolled had they not gotten that infection, right? Because we know all infections can cause chronic illnesses to kind of go haywire. So that's the one side of it. But then the other side of it is that in the unvaccinated individuals, it's not mild at all, right? We're still seeing those individuals get intubated. We're still seeing those people pass away, even with the Omicron variant, and have a lot of long-standing effects. In fact, the first death in the US was somebody who was unvaccinated but had previous exposure to COVID-19. So again, that nomenclature mild doesn't sit well with me. And I know that there's been thoughts that this is less neuroinvasive, or this is more in the upper airways, which is true. It does replicate more in the nasal passages, in the throat and pharyngeal passages. But is it milder because now so many individuals are vaccinated, and then about a third of those individuals are boosted now? We don't know. Is it a combination of the actual variant being quote unquote less severe, or a combination of the vaccine plus the variant? And I think it's very hard to tease that out. It's one of those chicken versus egg conversations.
Yeah, that gives it exactly the kind of nuance I was looking for. And Kai, jumping over to you, do you think that some of this perception that Omicron was less destructive, to just pick a random word there, there were a lot of journalists who reported it that way early on, and I'm wondering if we have some responsibility for the sense that this was not that dangerous, and if that sense encouraged more risky behaviors, or is it just that our understanding of what the variant was changed, and so we were sort of figuring it out like everyone else as it went.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what fascinates me about the variant beat, almost, like I feel like I've been reporting on variants now for over a year. What fascinates me about it is that there is so much uncertainty early on, and there is, I think Federico Kukso was giving a kind of impassioned plea earlier in the other panel about, following the evidence, and you can't really do that with the variants. In the beginning, there just isn't any evidence. And so you end up having to write a lot about what we don't know, why we don't know it, how we're going to find out about it. And you also have to choose very carefully who you talk to, because you are only going to get opinions in a sense, but it does matter, what the track record is of these people and what expertise they have. And so I found it really difficult, especially with Omicron, because this narrative came very early on from South Africa, where people were saying, doctors were saying, okay, we see a lot of mild cases. And it was very clear at that point that you wouldn't be able to just take the South African experience. They had 70% seropositivity in Gauteng province. So that means 70% of people there already had antibodies against the virus, even though they had very low vaccination rate of about 20% at the time. And it was clear that you can't just take that and apply that to any other place in the world and then assume that the same thing happens. So you have to give these caveats, but I also think that over time you do have to then shift your view. And I think this is something that with Omicron, more than the other things, is becoming very difficult. I think with Alpha, with Delta, there was this sense, okay, this could be bad, this could be more transmissible, it could even be more severe, but we have to wait for the data. This is what we know so far. And then it turned out they were more transmissible, they were more severe, and it was a problem. Now, with Omicron, the situation is different. And I think there is a sense now that a lot of people have just a frame how they think about these variants. And we have to shift it a little bit, because this is the first variant that's a real immune escape variant. So it is a little bit different from the variants we've seen before. And I do worry a little bit also that we give these variants too much agency, almost, in a sense. So while it is important to look at at all the characteristics of a new variant and what that might mean, the more important thing at the moment worldwide is the question of what's the immunity of the population that this virus is spreading in. And so I'm having a hard time sometimes now, when I'm talking to friends, when I'm talking to people on Twitter, explaining that, whether it's Omicron or another variant, we are in a different situation than we were, say, in December 2020 or in March 2021. It's the risk has gone down, mostly because of vaccination, and I think that is something that you have to communicate as well. I think for us science journalists, the risk is sometimes that we are the ones who want to be really, careful about these things, and so we explain all the caveats early on. But I do think you also, at the moment, have to accept that there is a difference in the risk scenario. And I find it really interesting if you take the US, where you have a lot of people really not changing the risk perception. There's people mostly, on the political right, who never thought this was dangerous, even though that was completely misguided, and they haven't really changed their view on that. And then on the other hand, you have the opposite, which is that some people who are triple vaccinated are as risk averse now as they were a year ago. And I think that's also not right. So the virus is going to keep producing these variants, but we are going to have to really take more than just the variant into account when we decide how to deal with it. And just one last thing, when I talk about agency with the virus, I think it's fascinating to me, and this seeps into all the reporting we do. We kind of write that, Delta replaced Alpha and Omicron replaced Delta and these things. It's not that this virus just comes and, shoves away the other one. In most places, Alpha was going down before Delta arrived, because we instituted measures that pushed the R of Alpha below 1, but then Delta came along, it was more transmissible, and so our measures weren't enough, and so Delta was increasing while Alpha was decreasing. We did that. It's not that the virus just came and pushed away Alpha. We actually managed to control Alpha, and then Delta came. Very similar situation in a lot of places. Take Germany, Delta cases were going down because of the measures. Now Omicron is coming and the measures aren't enough, partly because it spreads in vaccinated people as well. So there is a question of how we tell these stories and how much agency we give ourselves versus the virus. And I think if we give the virus too much agency, it feeds into this kind of sense of almost fate or, you know, inevitability, which I find so destructive at the moment. I'm reading a lot of old science fiction from like the 30s, 40s, where you have this kind of more techno-optimistic sense. And I'm just realizing that I'm really, you know, I mean, there's a lot wrong with that as well, but I'm missing the sense that we have a huge problem, but, you know, here's the agency we have, here's what we need to do, instead of sometimes framing these stories as if we're just, you know, victims of fate.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, I will say from a US perspective that a lot of science journalists here recognize that we have all these tools and people won't use them, right? So you also get a sense of, you know, banging your head against some kind of wall in which you're trying to get information out. I mean, and it really goes back to one of the, I think, the questions of journalism, you know, we're not advocates, right? So what we're supposed to do is give this honest information and then hope that people are going to respond in a reasonable way. And jumping backwards for a minute, because, you know, your talk about sort of the way we see variants was really interesting to me. One of the stories that I remember from early on, Angie, was that this coronavirus was not going to be all that mutant, right? That thank goodness it wasn't a flu virus, that, you know, we could come up with protective measures and they would have some stability. And, you know, maybe it's not as, you know, shifty as a flu virus, to use a kind of popular word, but it does seem like, did we underestimate the ability of this virus to change early on?
No, I don't think we actually did. I think, though, that those assumptions were based on the fact that we would be able to control this the way that we controlled the SARS classic epidemic. And that was fairly easily controlled. I mean, it wasn't, but it infected 8,000 people, partly because it was less transmissible than SARS coronavirus 2, but also partly because people were able to implement public health measures that really did control its spread, even after it spread to Canada. For example, you know, people were generally being febrile, so you could identify cases based on symptoms. There wasn't as much pre-symptomatic transmission, so it was a lot easier to control the SARS classic epidemic. And I think we made a lot of assumptions early on, obviously wrongly, that we would be able to do the same thing with this, and that we would not have a situation where there is ongoing transmission and there are ongoing surges. Where a lot of people are getting infected all at once, effectively. I think that, you know, the one thing we did know ahead of time is that this was going to have a mutation rate that was similar to other coronaviruses. And it's correct that coronaviruses, unlike orthomyxoviruses like influenza, cannot reassort. So their genome is one piece. It's not 8 separate pieces the way that the influenza genome is. So it can't shuffle up and mix with other coronaviruses as easily. There's also not a lot of other human coronaviruses that would necessarily be compatible for SARS coronavirus 2 to recombine with. So we know that also coronaviruses, I should add, have something that most RNA viruses don't, and that's limited proofreading capability. So they still have a higher mutation rate than a DNA virus or another organism that has DNA as its genetic material. But it's lower than most other RNA viruses. So they do have a lower mutation rate. And I think we made those assumptions that it wasn't going to reassort. There weren't going to be dramatic changes in antigenicity in terms of the immune responses that it invokes or elicits. And that it also wasn't going to get the opportunity to replicate as much as it has. Because it has had so much opportunity to transmit through the population, we are seeing, you know, it's just really a numbers game. We're seeing the number of mutations that we would expect with widespread transmission among billions of people.
That makes sense. And then, so when we see Omicron as a wave, and I will tell you that this is the first of the waves in which many people I know got COVID-19, right? I mean, I felt like my fellow science journalists and I were all hiding in our houses for 2 years, essentially, and no one got sick. And then suddenly I know so many people who have. is this predictive of, continued mutation and variation? And I'm just thinking of human hosts. I do want to come back to the animal host question, but I'd like to actually ask all three of you, is there anyone here who doesn't expect another variant of interest or variant of concern to arise?
I mean, I can start. We have 3 billion people in the world who have yet to receive a vaccine dose. So absolutely, I expect another variant to emerge. Whether it's going to have the same properties as Omicron, it's going to be more transmissible, potentially more pathogenic, equally as immune evasive, who knows? But certainly those are all possibilities on the table. Certainly Omicron has spread widely enough that now, and we are already seeing this, that there are sublineages of Omicron that appear to be outcompeting Omicron original recipe, at least in Denmark. So I think that we can certainly expect more variants, at least that are Omicron sublineages. But I'd be very surprised with the current state of the global population in terms of immune status if we didn't see more variants emerge.
Hervey?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Not only that, but I think at this point, it would be really foolish of any of us to really try to make any predictions, right? Because what the one constant is change and unpredictability in this pandemic. And there's so many factors that go into that: human behavior, the delay of the vaccine rollout. So absolutely. I mean, it's only a matter of time. Now, the main question would be, how are our current vaccinations and efforts, will they hold up against those future variants? And that story remains untold. I'm still fairly optimistic. I know so much of this pandemic has been focused on antibodies, but myself, as well as many others, have been since the beginning screaming, but look at the T cells, right? And there was a great review in Nature recently that spoke about that, specifically natural killer cells, that the glimmer of optimism is that, these cells still recognize Omicron very well, especially where the antibodies fail. And that's actually good news, in my opinion, because it's those T cell responses that we get from the vaccine and, beyond that really help, I think, blunt very severe disease, meaning hospitalizations and death. So let's see. I mean, a lot is unknown, but I think we can all bet on there likely will be another variant of concern, especially given the vaccination issues and others. It's human behavior in general.
And do you agree, Kai?
Yeah, I certainly do. And maybe let me run through 4 points really quickly. So one, when we talk about variants of concern, we usually, use the WHO nomenclature. Now, Omicron is interesting because actually Omicron is a lineage that technically doesn't really exist. It's a parent lineage of, several different lineages. So in the beginning, Omicron, what we mostly saw was something that's BA1 in the pangolin lineage. And no, that's actually not I think that's the next strain lineage. Anyway, there's a lot of different nomenclatures, which is an interesting problem when talking about these things. But so there's BA1 and there's BA2, which are sister lineages. And we're now seeing BA2 maybe displace BA1. Certainly we see it in Denmark, we see it in the UK to some extent. Again, all the caveats apply. You can talk about this for 50 minutes, but basically it suggests that it might have a transmissibility advantage. What exactly that comes from, we will see. If that's the case, it could be, for instance, that the WHO at some point decides that BA2 gets its own name. Part of the problem is that BA1 has a specific mutation that allows us to detect it fairly easily. It's the S gene dropout, which we already saw in alpha. So you can see it in certain PCRs. And that's not the case for BA2, which is why it's sometimes called a stealth variant. But I find that a bit annoying, to be honest. So it is possible that that's already the next variant, which would be really interesting because that's a pattern we haven't seen so far. I think the second point I want to make is just we are probably also going to see recombination. There is another sister lineage called BA3, which seems to be a recombinant of BA1 and BA2. Again, there's a lot of caveats, but that's what we think is probably the case. Now, it's absolutely possible that we're going to see recombinants, for instance, between Delta and Omicron. What they would look like, is anyone's guess. I think it's really simplistic to just assume that they're going to be as immune escapee as Omicron, but as fit as Delta. It could be very different. So that's, in a way, really fascinating, actually, for me to to think about and to find out what nature ends up coming up with. the third point is that this is the first immune escape variant we've seen. And I don't think there's any reason to assume that this is all this virus can do. It has shown us one possible kind of constellation that allows it to escape the immunity that we now have in humanity. But there could be a lot of other constellations. And if you do an antigenic map and you look where these lie, it could be that the virus goes off in a different direction. It could be that we finally get a kind of second generation variant of concern that actually builds on the previous one. So far, every variant of concern has had kind of an independent origin, which, by the way, to me, when we talk about origin questions, that is the most interesting question now, because I think it doesn't really matter that much for the trajectory of this pandemic where the virus originally came from. It does matter a lot where these variants are coming from, because they are going to keep coming, and the better we understand how they evolve, the more we're likely to actually be able to do something about it. Last point, I just want to push back a little bit against something that Angie said, and I feel like, especially when it comes to evolution, we always have all of these narratives that kind of sound convincing, but I'm not sure that we actually have the evidence for it. And one of these is all this talk about we need to share vaccines equitably in order to avoid variants from coming. We need to share vaccines equitably because that's the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do, and it's going to reduce overall the deaths and the burden of disease in this world. Every life on this planet is equally valuable, and it makes no sense to be boostering 20-year-olds in one country while people at risk in another country, don't get a single shot. No question about that. But if I look around the world at the moment, it is the countries that have the highest vaccination rate that are allowing themselves to let the virus spread unchecked. So Denmark clearly is a place, that you would expect maybe a variant to evolve. That goes against this idea that if we distribute the vaccines equitably, that reduces the risk of variants. The other point is that as long as we don't know how these variants really evolve, is it in an animal reservoir? Is it in people who have chronic infections? What kind of people? As long as we don't really know it, I feel like we're overstepping if we say we know how to avoid them evolving. So this is just one of those examples where I think, we tell these stories, and I understand why we tell them, because there's a lot of very, very egotistical people in this world. And sometimes you have to, and you use this argument to argue for equitable access to vaccines. And it's easier if you tell people, hey, it's in your own interest, because that way the variants aren't going to come. We're just prolonging the pandemic. I get that. Doesn't mean that it's true. And I think in the long run, in all of these debates, we lose a lot of credibility and also just, it's a chance to argue for ethical behavior for the right reasons, I think, which aren't always self-interest. I know that Angie agrees to a large extent. I think I just wanted to push back on that because it's in the broader public, and also, to be frank, by the WHO, it's been used a lot as an argument. And I think we have to be very, very careful with that.
Do you want to respond to that, Angie?
Yeah, actually, I really misspoke, and this is probably a good example in real time of how you need to choose your words very carefully when talking about this topic, because I completely agree with everything that Kai just said. And as I started off at the beginning, saying we don't really know where Omicron came from, there's no guarantee that vaccinating the world is going to stop variants entirely. And in fact, we are on the road. Zero COVID is not realistic. We are not going to eliminate this virus. There are so many species besides humans. We will not be able to vaccinate all of the susceptible wild animals, even the domestic animals on the planet that can be infected with this virus. So variants will continue to emerge. The real question is, how much does that matter to us, I think? And that's where the vaccine equity argument comes in, because vaccine equity, so people who are vaccinated, and especially people who are boosted, are less likely to transmit the virus, and less likely to be infected, even though they can do both with Omicron. So and this really argues for really, I think, the central point of what Kai was saying, that we argue these things in self-interest, but we should be arguing them in terms of the population, because when people are at population immunity, and this was absolutely the case with the Salk polio vaccine, for example, which is not sterilizing. It does not completely prevent infection, and yet it effectively eliminated polio, because polio can infect a lot of other animal species, within 10 years in the US. But that required a very, very high level of vaccination. So if we get enough people vaccinated, there will be fewer variants emerging, probably, because people will be getting less sick. They won't be such a public health problem. And overall prevalence, at least in the human population, will be down compared to what it is now. But Kai's absolutely right that the countries that are doing the worst, and Denmark yesterday decided to pretty much raise the white flag in all of their efforts to control transmission. Vaccines alone cannot do that. So we need to apply other methods as well. We also need to be surveilling and looking for this virus so that we can apply some of these countermeasures if there is an outbreak of a variant that is more likely to spread in vaccinated populations. So I agree with everything that Kai said. I think this is a great example of really needing to choose your words carefully when trying to make these arguments, because variants are here to stay. But the question for the long-term outlook for us is, how long are they going to continue to be a huge public health problem for us?
That is such an interesting conversation there. Purvi, do you want to add to it, and or do you have a perspective on this? And I also wanted to ask you something that I've seen come up, which is the suggestion that being infected with Omicron might not be that protective against some of the other variants, that it's unique enough in its genetic structure that you might, if you got Omicron, definitely be resistant, I'm guessing, to other Omicron variants, but not necessarily to Delta, say. Could you talk about both the vaccination point that was raised here, but also just the basic immunology of what we know about this variant?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. Vaccines don't guarantee zero variants, right? They are supposed to just set us up for success. They don't also even guarantee zero infections, right? That's case in point with flu vaccine and other vaccines, pneumonia vaccine. We see cases every year. The whole point is we want to reduce deaths. We want to reduce hospitalizations and hopefully reduce transmissibility too, because if you're less virulent, if you have less virus replicating within you, then theoretically you should be less likely to pass it on. So I absolutely agree with that, but still, also for the points mentioned, vaccine equity is important, right? Because everyone deserves to have that protection against the severe disease, against death, but yeah, by all means, that's no guarantee. There are no guarantees. As for immunity for Omicron and how that will play out with future variants, the simple answer, like everything in this pandemic, we don't know. And there is, again, with that, no guarantee, right, that Omicron will be protective. We have seen a little bit of the reverse. There is some data out of South Africa that people infected with Omicron are in better shape against, let's say, Delta, for example. But on the flip side of that, we've been seeing reinfections of Omicron, even within the last 6 weeks, of people coming out of Omicron and then getting sick again, or people who had Alpha or Delta and then, developing Omicron, whether, boosted or not, or mild or not. So the whole point is that there is no specific guarantee. Again, I had earlier spoken about the T cells, which I think out of all of the parts of the immune system have been the most resilient to variants thus far. And if I was going to make a prediction, even though I said we shouldn't, I would say that the T cells will continue to be the most resilient. And that is what fares the best. When you look at patients even early on in the pandemic who were undergoing cytokine storm in the ICU, a lot of these patients, they did show T cell exhaustion. They showed severe lymphopenia. So I believe those T cell immune responses are so crucial now and for future variants, especially against that severe disease, hospitalizations. And it may even give us a sense of understanding why certain individuals become so sick with this virus and why some don't, right? I really believe that there is something deeper there, and I'm hoping more research is targeted there. But as for Omicron being protective against other variants, we don't know, but I do believe at least the T cell immunity will be resilient, even though up till now we're seeing that the antibody immunity is more evasive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I have so many more questions. I'm like a question machine, but we have a ton of really wonderful questions from people who have joined this webinar. So I'm going to shift over to that. I want to mention before we got started that earlier, Dr. Maria Kirchhoff from the WHO was supposed to join us, but she was unable to do So due to a very recent time conflict. So
Deborah, can I add one thing?
Yes, Kai.
Because I think, I mean, as to, your question about cross immunity, I think it is really, really fascinating, because one of the things that maybe hasn't sunk in yet so much is that there is, of course, the possibility that we are going to get several variants circulating at the same time. I mean, Christian Drosten, for instance, has for a long time argued that we are on the path now to getting a different serogroup. So basically, this is what happens if you have, one virus that doesn't produce immunity maybe against one with a very different spike. So that adds a whole interesting layer to the evolution that we might be seeing in the next months, because if there's several of these variants, at least two circulating at the same time, it might become important for doctors to know which one a certain patient has, because it could decide whether you're using a certain monoclonal antibody treatment, for instance. It would also just add to the burden of disease. So there is this whole, I mean, when we say the evolution of Omicron, or the evolution of SARS-CoV-2 isn't over yet, I mean, there's a whole nother, level of things that can start to happen now. And we really have to see what this new world where we have a lot of immunity in the population, what that does to the evolutionary trajectory of SARS-CoV-2. And I think it's, I understand that it's scary sometimes, but it is scientifically incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point, and I wish we had all the. I mean, one of the things that's very clear is we're still figuring this out, right? But man, there's so many interesting questions that this particular pandemic has raised. I'm not saying that's a bright spot in the idea that isn't it great we had a pandemic so we could find out all these fascinating things, but it does raise really fascinating questions. And I'm going to start with questions from our viewers, and they are divided into a number of categories. Purvi, there's a couple of questions raised about both viral reinfection and the fact that in some families, one person may be COVID positive, but another person doesn't get the virus at all, even though they're heavily exposed. So these questions run in a kind of, they sort of hold hands. One is, did I understand that you could be infected by Omicron more than once? But first get it and then get reinfected. And there have been many cases in a family where someone has had COVID and other members of the family do not get infected. Do we understand what's going on there? And this is from Susan Ruiz Pena and Jose Jimenez from Guatemala.
Right. Yeah. So it is possible, albeit very, very rare, to have Omicron and get reinfected again. There have been cases that we've seen. What's been more common is that we've seen people that have had other variants or other strains then get Omicron, because mutationally it is so different. But also, again, that's also not exceedingly common, right? So that's also very, very rare. But what I'm saying is that it is possible, including, the death that we saw in the US, that was a gentleman who was exposed, we believe, to Delta, and then developed Omicron and ultimately passed away despite having that previous exposure. So these are very interesting. And as the virus continues to evolve, I think we may see more cases of it. And then also to Kai's point, I mean, I do believe that there are strains of Delta still circulating. I mean, we knew as recently as around Christmas time, initially the CDC had said Omicron was the most variant strain. Then they backtracked and said, oh, actually, it's 60% Omicron, 40% Delta. So a lot of those infections that even occurred in December, I believe were likely Delta, especially some that still behaved as quote unquote Delta with, those still, neuroinvasive symptoms, with the higher fevers, with different lower respiratory symptoms as well. So again, is it reinfection with the same variant? We don't know. Is it reinfection with different variants? And now, as Angie and Kai have noted, that there's even variants of the Omicron itself. So all of this has to be teased out. And I think it's very interesting question that Kai raised, that will we now have testing that's variant specific? Because I think as a clinician, that would be huge, right? Because certain hospitals in my region stopped giving monoclonal antibodies at one point because they were like, okay, this is not going to work. It's only Omicron, which I don't think was the case, right? I think there was still Delta occurring, and maybe people could have benefited from Regeneron monoclonal antibody treatments while we waited on those sotiramab antibodies to arrive in our state. So all very interesting questions, and there's no easy answer.
So there's some questions about BA2 here, and interestingly enough, I'm going to tie it to a question from Esther Hawima, which is, do variants die? And I think that not necessarily, but variants, as I understand it, can be outcompeted. So one of the questions here is whether we expect BA2 to outcompete BA1 with Omicron, and do we think it's going to lead us to more severe illness?
So I guess that's probably for me. The first answer is we'll see. You know, we have seen that BA2 certainly seems to be doing better than BA1 in Denmark, and as Kai mentioned, also potentially in the UK. We'll really have to see how they perform in sort of a head-to-head variant off when they, you know, BA2 has been imported to other countries, so we'll see how that does. So we don't really know, but I think that in terms of do variants die, that's a very interesting question, and it's one that for virologists we could probably have like a week-long seminar on it because people still don't agree whether viruses are even alive in the first place. But variants certainly can become extinct. So any virus has to have a host in order to reproduce, in order to replicate. If it doesn't find a new host, or if there's already another virus there that prevents infection and successful replication in a host, then eventually, yeah, that virus will become extinct. And we've certainly seen that early lineages of SARS coronavirus 2 are no longer circulating, at least not in the human population. And Omicron itself is actually, this is one of the big mysteries about Omicron and its origins, is most closely related to viruses that were circulating in the human population in mid-2020, in late spring, early summer 2020. So where that virus went in the meantime is, again, there's several different hypotheses for where it could have gone. But, you know, viruses in the human population, variants can certainly become extinct, outcompeted, or at least circulating at low enough levels that they're not going to be recognized by the genomic surveillance systems that are in place, which are very, very patchy and certainly aren't covering the entire breadth of the coronavirus variants that are circulating right now in the human population. We have no idea what's happening in the animal population for the most part.
I want to just stick with that animal population question for a minute. And we know that's true with influenza viruses too, that they can move back and forth between animal hosts and human hosts. Does that also, the fact that coronaviruses are able to do this as well? I'm thinking there's quite an interesting reservoir of white-tailed deer, for instance, in the United States that are infected with this virus. Does that also suggest that we are going to see, is that also predictive of additional variants? You certainly raised that possibility with Omicron, for instance.
Well, I'm so glad you asked that because that's actually something that my lab is looking at right now. But apart from the white-tailed deer, you know, there is some evidence that some animals have been infected. There have been a number of case reports of zoo animals being infected, many big cats, things like that. Certainly domestic cats are susceptible. It's thought that many small carnivores are susceptible. And certainly Omicron, as well as alpha, beta, and gamma, are all naturally mouse adapted, rodent adapted as well. So there's a number of candidate species, but honestly, we haven't really started to even scratch the surface of how many animals might actually be out there that are infected and that do have different variants, potentially animal-specific variants of SARS coronavirus 2 circulating in those population. But I think the white-tailed deer has been a big wake-up call for everybody, that animals that, you know, may or may not be perceived as even having that much human contact, although deer do have quite a bit of human contact, are in fact getting infected with SARS coronavirus-2 derived from humans, and then it's continuing to circulate in those populations, what the impact will be on future evolutionary trajectory of the virus, what the impact will be on human public health, what the impact will be on animal health or One Health, as we talk about, is really anybody's guess, but it's something we definitely need to look into more. And my lab, as well as others, are starting to do just that.
Boy, I see another webinar in our future, right? Andres Sibayone from Johannesburg, South Africa, is wondering about the effect of the anti-vax movement. He's specifically looking at vaccine resistance in South Africa on the trajectory of this variant, not just vaccine inequity, but refusal to get vaccinated. And he wonders, Kai, specifically, whether journalists are covering this in an adequate way, and acknowledging the low rate of vaccinations in a country like South Africa as variants emerge.
Okay. I think that's one of those really, really tricky questions. I think so. I think for me as a journalist, I've always tried to understand complexity and bring nuance to stories. It's not always easy. I'm very lucky. I work at an outlet where I can do that. It's not always possible. This is one of those examples. I don't have the background to know all the relevant information here, but it is one of those topics where really you have to look very, very closely at it, because, you know, some of the stories that I've seen either say, oh, look, you know, this country, which has a low vaccination rate and is a lower middle income country, is actually throwing away these doses that it got donated. So why are we even sending them? Or, you know, there's so much vaccine hesitancy there, it makes no sense to even send the vaccine there. Yes, there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in a lot of countries, and it's not all rich Western countries. And yes, some countries that are, you know, in desperate need of vaccine actually had to get rid of a lot of vaccine, partly for the reason that they were donated so close to their expiry date that it just wasn't realistic for them to use them in a vaccination drive. All of these things have a lot of reasons, and you can't just. The problem with these complex questions is that you can't just say, oh, look, there's vaccine hesitancy there, so, you know, then it doesn't make sense to even send anything there. The way that we have presented these vaccines, the way that we have distributed them unfairly so far, the way that we talk about these vaccines, and the way that we talk about donating them, all of that matters, and all of that plays into certain narratives. And, you know, certainly the way that we dealt with the AstraZeneca vaccine, for instance, in parts of Europe, where we decided a lot of countries stopped vaccinating their populations with the AstraZeneca vaccine because they felt the risk-benefit didn't make sense, because they had other vaccines available that had a better risk-benefit ratio. Now, we then started sending these vaccines as donations to other countries. And of course, that creates a narrative that you're basically giving what we consider a second-rate vaccine to other places. Mm-hmm. I want to be very clear that AstraZeneca vaccine, you know, provides a lot of protection, and especially where it matters, the T cells, when we're talking about protection from severe disease and death, is really good. But we had these stories about the rare side effects that this vaccine caused, and the way that we dealt with that, you can't just take that out of the story and then say, oh, look, there's vaccine hesitancy. You know, it's one of those, I think there's this line in Cold Mountain where somebody says, you know, they make the weather and then they stand in the rain and then they say it's raining. It's one of those situations to me where it is, you know, you do have to look at everything, and the inequity itself, the way that we've dealt with it, plays into this. And so we should be trying to solve the supply side issue here. We should be making sure these vaccines are distributed equitably. And then, of course, there's also, you know, a challenge in most countries, including here in Germany, including in a lot of other countries, to actually convince people to take these vaccines and to explain to them why these vaccines are life-saving and really, really important. But you can't just take these little, you know, you can't just take these things out of context and then try to argue with them that, for instance, it doesn't make sense to send these vaccines. I think that's been done sometimes, and the question sounded like it got at that a little bit. So I just think that's not good journalism in a way.
And I have one very quick last question, as we're about out of time, unfortunately, that sums up some of the questions it combines a bunch of questions I've seen, which is, we've talked a lot about the evolution of the virus, but do we predict any kind of dramatic evolution of vaccines against COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 that are more comprehensive, use different approaches, protein-based vaccines, for instance, that I don't think really got any traction this time around? I mean, do you predict that we'll see vaccines evolving along with the virus?
I mean, I certainly do. And granted, I need to disclose that I am a research scientist at a vaccine research institute, but who is making a protein vaccine. But I do think that, there's been a huge effort, not only to develop new vaccines using the mRNA technology, but there have been new protein technologies employed too, as well as new adjuvants, new production methods, things like that. There have been these adenovirus vectored vaccines as well, like AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, that are not new technologies, but they're new on the market anyways. And I think that, there is a place for all of these vaccines. I think that what Kai just said is incredibly important, because we can't be ranking this vaccine as better than the other one. All vaccines have some utility if they work at all. For example, these protein vaccines may not be useful for the primary series for everybody, but they certainly could be useful for boosters in the future. And potentially, as people continue to develop these technologies, as we're past the pandemic and we move on, maybe we do start using some of these vaccines. Maybe they do have some advantages over the mRNA technology as we incorporate COVID vaccines into the normal vaccination schedule. And then finally, there is a huge effort building on efforts that were already in place for influenza to make pan-coronavirus vaccines. So I think that we'll be seeing all of these different vaccine technology platforms trying to develop those, or at least vaccines that would protect potentially against all sarbecoviruses or the SARS-like coronaviruses. So I think that, there's really a lot of things coming down the pipeline in terms of vaccines that will continue to improve and be more safe and more effective.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Kai, Purvi, do you have any final thoughts? You've been a fabulous panel, I have to say. I feel much.
Maybe, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no. I was just going to echo exactly what Angie said. Yeah, it's actually exciting that there are so many different vaccine platforms under study, because we may find very well one works better as a booster than another, one works better for a variant versus other. And yeah, the pan-coronavirus vaccines are very exciting, as well as some of these whole virus vaccines and protein subunits. But the one thing that I'm also very excited to see is the mucosal immunity vaccines that are being developed. Because yes, maybe for an initial inoculation, this may not be ideal, but for a variant that loves the nasopharyngeal passages like Omicron or whatever the future holds, this may actually be a great option for a booster or to provide that extra inoculation.
Maybe just, as a nerd, I get super excited about all of these different approaches, and I think we're going to see a lot of this coming, and that's really, really good. As a science journalist, what I've learned in this pandemic is that we already have really good tools. We're not using them nearly the way that we could be. And so I think, whatever comes down the pipeline and whenever it comes, it is very clear to me that right now we really have to, work on this fundamental problem of getting good information to people about these vaccines that we have, other vaccines that might come, and really work to counter this polarization. Because I really worry, even for other vaccines, but certainly for anything that's a coronavirus vaccine, this polarization is going to make it pretty much impossible to use these vaccines in the best way possible, and to just get people to look at them in a rational way, in a way. And so, that's, I think, for the next years, whatever tools we have in this pandemic, it's the saddest thing has been how badly we've used the tools we have already. So I'm excited about any new tools coming, but please let's not, pretend that when that tool comes in 2 years, it'll magically solve anything. If anything, we could be, if we don't do the work now, we're going to be in an even worse situation in terms of using these.
And on that happy note, you guys have just been fabulous. I've enjoyed every minute of this conversation, and I want to thank you for your time and all of the really interesting information you've shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was a fabulous discussion. I didn't want this panel to end. I think it was especially helpful for journalists in the room who may not have a science background and who are really trying to deepen their understanding of the COVID-19 mutations and variants. So thank you again, everyone. Our next panel is going to focus on COVID-19 vaccines and medications. And we have a great lineup of panelists who are joining us from around the world and who will bring a valuable global perspective to this conversation. But before we turn to this panel, I did just want to mention a few notes for those of you who may just be joining us. First, I want to remind everyone that we're streaming this webinar onto YouTube, and we've posted links to each stream in the chat. So if at any point you are having trouble with Zoom, you can just tune in via YouTube and find it there. Also, as a reminder, this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into Arabic, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. So if you'd like to follow along in one of those languages, just click on the little interpretation globe in the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen and select your preferred language. Lastly, we do want this to be conversational, so we encourage you to ask your questions and to post them in the Zoom chat. And we are looking through those and curating them, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So now, without further ado, I want to turn our attention to our third and final panel. And I'm going to turn the conversation back over to Deborah, who will introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Valerie. This is a great panel looking at vaccine equity, and it includes Mohammed Yahya from Egypt, Amy Maximum, who is joining us from the United States, Akin Joma from Nigeria, Josh Mashok from the USA again, and Margaret Harris, who is joining us from Switzerland. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to start by just reading one paragraph from a Washington Post story that was published yesterday, which looked at vaccine equity and made this point. High-income countries have administered about 14 times the number of doses per inhabitant compared with low-income countries. The WHO, this is from a WHO survey. About 84% of the population of the African Union, for instance, has yet to receive a single shot, even as about 40% of Americans have received vaccine booster shots, according to the post-vaccine tracker. So clearly that's a portrait of inequity, right? And so what I want to do is get at that, but also really try to, assess what the issues are within equity and protection, the responsibilities of these wealthy, high-income countries, the responsibilities of countries that are looking for vaccines or more vaccines. We have a lot to talk about. And I'd like to start with Josh. Josh, this is one of the things you look at for the Kaiser Foundation is equitable distribution of medicines and vaccines. And I'd just be interested, beyond that very quick quote that I read, if you could, from your perspective, assess kind of where we are and what kind of effect you think it's having on the pandemic.
Sure, it's great to be here and part of this panel. So thanks. It's a real honor. So to answer your question, yes, I think that we can still characterize the state of global vaccine equity as completely unjust and inequitable, as that brief statistic gave you a glimpse of. So when we look at regions, so you mentioned the Africa region there, or if we look at by income level, there is just a massive gap between the percent of populations that's vaccinated in, say, low-income countries compared to high-income countries. So the latest data that we have, for example, looking at low-income countries, it's still less than 10% of the populations that have been vaccinated with at least one dose. And so what does that mean? I mean, it given that vaccination is the primary means of prevention that we have, and the most effective means of prevention that we have, getting that tool out as widely as possible and correcting the imbalance in access that we see right now is just at the very top of the priority list for the global response and for countries themselves. Now, it's been a long road. I mean, we have had some successes, clearly. We have given 10 billion doses or something to that effect in a year's time. And the global equity problem has been addressed to some extent with the use of the COVAX financing and distribution mechanism for COVID-19 vaccines. But clearly it hasn't met the challenge, and it's really been a reflection of the ongoing injustice of having high-income countries snap up the doses that have been available, much of the doses up until now, and pharmaceutical companies placing COVAX and other mechanisms to get vaccines to low-income countries and to regions lower on the list, and that's left us in this position that we are in now. It's really important to address this. Things have improved, and maybe we can talk more about that as we go, but it certainly is a dire picture still for vaccine equity.
Yes, and we're very fortunate with this panel to be able to do some specific sort of case studies of what that looks like in countries in Africa, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And I wonder, Mohammed, if you could talk about that situation in Egypt, how much the failure to supply vaccine has impacted the country, where the government's responsibility lies in distributing vaccine and information so that people want the vaccine. I'd be interested to hear your take.
Sure. Thanks, Deborah. Very happy to be here with this panel. So very, very briefly, I can give an overview of some of the issues that we've been facing in Egypt, as an example. But I think this extends to several other countries in the region. I think the first of them was obviously access to vaccines and getting vaccines. So for a period of time, there were very little vaccine availability. So you'd have to be on a waiting list that could extend for several months to get your first shot. And then that was coupled with, I think, very poor communication around the vaccine. And that has come from both the science journalists or mainstream journalists as well, who were covering the pandemic, because everyone was covering the pandemic, obviously, but also from many figures from the healthcare community. So doctors, for example, who would they would put up videos on social medias or tell their patients that they should not get the vaccine because it's not been tested, it's been rushed. We don't know what's the long-term side effects that it could have on people. So that created a kind of fear among the population. So when availability became better, when we were starting to see some vaccines come in, a lot of people were very resistant to taking these vaccines. And it was quite interesting because historically, there's never been an anti-vax movement per se in Egypt. People take childhood vaccines very seriously. Everyone takes them. Everyone believes in how effective they are. Everyone is very concerned to make sure that they take these vaccines. But it came to that particular vaccine and it was just different. People did not want to take it because of all the communication around it. And that created this gap where once availability increased, demand kind of decreased. People were not taking up the vaccine. And I think the other issue as well that I would add to that is distribution. So while larger cities in Egypt were able to get a lot of doses of the vaccine, it wasn't the same in rural regions. And I think that's probably similar to many other countries, including developed countries or northern countries, for example. But it was quite pronounced here, where communication was poor and the availability was quite low. So in many of these cities and towns, hardly anyone has got vaccinated. So while Egypt now is at about 20% vaccination, the majority of that is in cities. And it's also been driven by government mandates where, for example, all teachers had to get vaccinated, or all public sector workers had to get vaccinated. So that's been the kind of driver in increasing the vaccination rates lately.
Well, that's interesting. I'd like to come back to mandates as we go further into the conversation too. Akin, could you talk about this same kind of issue from a Nigerian perspective?
It's in when you look at COVID, we have to look at who understands COVID. Because when you hold government accountable, you also need to hold the scientific community accountable. What has been the response? Who knows more about COVID than any other person? We depend on science to a large extent. But despite all the challenges that we've had in terms of misinformation, in terms of key issue that has to do with the purveyor of the information itself, a lot of damage has been done, at the onset before we get to where we were. And in a number of countries, politicians were the first to speak out about COVID. I mean, we know of the former president of the United States and so on and so forth. And when the time came to respond, panels that were set up, expert committees and so on and so forth were loaded with politicians, people who don't really know much about what was going on. And it takes the effort of a few journalists to write about the panel, for example, the national team, in Nigeria, for them to put a leading scientist among those who are going to be, those who are going to more or less manage the response, in the country. But the key thing is we all need to hold ourselves accountable. When HIV came, the media played a very good, leading role in terms of response to HIV, in terms of getting the information out and so on and so forth, because HIV was something we did not understand. COVID also we did not understand, but the damage that had been done in terms of the kind of information, videos and all the other things that Mohammed talked about. People send out materials that are not relevant to the fight against COVID. A lot of people send things sent as received. And it was mentioned by, I think, the immediate panel that before us, that you have a situation where materials are sent is not verified, especially on social media. When HIV came, we didn't have social media at that time, but we have to work on what we had, as journalists, getting research papers, getting journals to write the story. And this was as far back as in the 90s. HIV came to Nigeria. The first case was in '86, and the media was following up. Then the military said in Nigeria that they had discovered a cure, through one immunologist. And those were issues that came out, from East Africa, to West Africa, to other parts of Africa, of people saying that they had a cure. But the media came against those establishments in a way that, we address the issues, holding scientists, the scientific community, the Ministry of Health responsible, accountable, for the kind of information that we have. What is the response rate? How do we ensure that the kind of information we pass out are information that are authentic, and relevant to the lives of communities? And a lot of a lot of things happen across the world. Now we have a global village. But when it comes to COVID, is a different ball game. Whatever happens in the US today, can happen here in Nigeria, tomorrow. It takes less than 24 hours to fly from one part of the world, to the other, except in certain cases. So the key thing is we all need to hold ourselves accountable in a way that we are responsible. Being responsible is a personal thing, either as individual or government, because when we say government, it's individuals like you and I that are in government. And we can't shy away from our responsibility to address the key issues. And as media, as journalists, as science journalists, most especially, science journalists are the elites of journalism in terms of when it comes to reporting science in itself. So accountability cut across, but government need to lead, and we need to follow, and lead us into the right direction.
Yes, I think that that's one of the most important things we do is accountability journalism. Amy, one of the things that actually came up in the previous panel, which was on viral evolution, was that although the United States, for instance, is, has a higher access to vaccines and is more vaccinated than, not as vaccinated as it should be, obviously, but is more vaccinated, yet we are being crushed by Omicron, right? That it's like been this tidal wave of infections here in which our over access to vaccines appears not to have made that much of a difference. Well, obviously it's made some difference, but that goes counter to the narrative that, having a great access to vaccines is going to break up the pandemic. And so I wonder if you could address that and then move on to your, more global perspective on equity. United States on the hot spot, so to speak. And then what does that mean? What does that tell us about what's going on elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. I think, to your first point, I think it's kind of a both answer. It's not, do we have enough supply and that's going to be sufficient to vaccinate everyone? It's you need the supply, you need the supply chains, the distribution that has to be good. Here you can remember in the beginning of our rollout, people were sad that they couldn't get appointments. It was quite hard. That takes a lot of work. So, credit where credit's due. It is not simple to get vaccines everywhere. That's costly and it takes a lot of logistical planning and a lot of people. So there's that, and there's the communication piece of it. So it's sort of all three things. It's not you have the vaccines and magically everybody just gets them. I think the U.S. has a difficult time for a few reasons. I don't know if I don't know if I would go as far to say that we're being hit worse than anywhere. I mean, surely in terms of infections, we have a massive number of infections. And I wonder how much the US is really fueling the pandemic around the world. But, deaths might be quite high in other places. We know that there's a real lack of testing in many, many, many countries. So we might not be seeing how badly some places are hit. And so vaccines, to be clear, vaccines have really made this a less deadly surge than it would be otherwise. It would be much, much worse. But, the US has some special problems. Of course, a big one being that right now we're sort of very politically divisive, and one side of that often embraces sort of these small government, anti-regulation, that's sort of the ideology, and that can bleed into being against sort of anything that the establishment says. There's a real loss in trust in establishments, and that's the government, that's the media, that's everyone, and that's a huge problem for the U.S. And that's sort of sad. I think in other countries, I've heard there might be some people that aren't wearing masks, for example, but it's not so strictly, are you in this political party or that political party? So I think that's really been to our detriment. The news media, especially TV news, has been really awful in this respect. Also, we have kind of a very federated country where states have a lot of power. We saw that recently with the Supreme Court turning down the federal idea to have a vaccine mandate in companies that are more than 100 people. And so that sort of works against us because public health often does need to have some sort of law behind it because it's not what's best for the market, at least in the short term, a lot of times. So I think these are a lot of reasons why the US is sort of a special study on its own.
Okay, I agree with everything you're saying here, and I want to go more global again by turning to Margaret and saying the WHO has really taken a position, I think, from the beginning that equitable distribution of vaccines was one of the ways that we would be able to get a grip on this pandemic. I mean, have you felt heard? Have you encountered pushback more from wealthy countries? Can you tell me, your sense of how you've been able to argue that successfully or not? What's working?
Well, certainly it's been quite a journey. Right from the start, you're quite right. We worked out that the only way out of this, if we got vaccination, was to vaccinate equitably and do it according to the people most at risk, the top priority groups, the healthcare workers, because they're the most exposed and they're the people we rely on to keep us all going. And then the people who are most vulnerable to getting the severe forms of the disease, because that's the sticky end, that's the pointy end of this pandemic. A lot of people don't get that sick. But when you have huge numbers of infections, you've got huge numbers with severe illness and sadly, far too much loss of life. So, yeah. And we saw from HIV, for instance, how once some effective treatments became available, they were stockpiled. They were sucked up by the wealthy countries, and people with the least resources, but often with the worst outbreaks, couldn't get access to those tools. So it was very, very clear to us that one of the critical things to get going was a worldwide system of equitable distribution where everybody vaccinated at the same time. And ideally, that's why this COVAX that you've heard mentioned was set up. And it was actually set up very much or driven by the wealthy countries. The European Union, France, they all stood up there, Britain, they all stood up there and said, this is what we need. This is what we need to do. And the idea was that everybody essentially pool their resources, those who could pay for it and finance it, got their vaccines via COVAX, but paid for them. Those who couldn't pay for them also got access at the same time. Well, as you know, the great intentions, but history turned out to be very different, because once those vaccines became available, people rushed for the lifeboats. And as we've seen in any disaster, those are the biggest and strongest get to the lifeboats first. And so we saw very early, first half of this year, and I've just been looking at the numbers, the wealthy countries began to vaccinate and the numbers really started to accelerate from March 2020. And when you looked at the low-income countries, flatline, absolutely nothing happening. Now, you did exactly hear us. You said, well, we were certainly screaming. We were screaming from whatever rooftop or whatever place you could go. In fact, people, I think, were almost sick of us. At some point, I remember being interviewed on the BBC saying, well, yes, we in Britain are now vaccinating well, and you say that it should all be all health workers and all vulnerable people all at the same time around the world. So what do you say when we get to our young, healthy population? Should we stop and give our vaccines elsewhere? And I actually said, well, that's really, yes. And I became the most hated woman in Britain for at least a day. I couldn't turn on the TV for quite a while. But that really, when we talk about enlightened self-interest, that was what it was about. Although that's a pretty tough sell in countries that were experiencing horrendous outbreaks. That Britain, for instance, the UK, had an enormous outbreak driven by Alpha this time last year, and they were losing huge numbers of people, and they're in a terrible position. So one of the other difficulties has been that the epidemiology, the worst epidemiology, has actually often been in the wealthiest, best resourced countries. So you can understand leadership there saying, well, look, we've got to get people vaccinated here as well. The problem was there was overbooking, hoarding, all sorts of murky stuff going on with contracts. So even though the COVAX system had pre-booked contracts, had arrangements, they all went they went sort of with the panic, shall we say. So we really couldn't get supply until about the middle of 2021. We really didn't see anything much. In fact, in June we were saying cupboard's bare. There is nothing coming. And many of the countries dependent on COVAX who were expecting to get their full delivery, their full supplies, and who had already were planning their vaccination programs and, you know, preparing to do this, we couldn't tell them when they'd have vaccine. We could not give them sightline. Now that's improved a great deal. In fact, the sort of trickle, or the few little drops, have turned into a flood. And I think you mentioned already the Nigerian situation, where they suddenly got a huge amount of donated vaccine. I don't think that necessarily came through COVAX, but they got large amounts of donated vaccine very, very rapidly with a very short shelf life. So they were in a very difficult position. If you suddenly flood a country with vaccine, they're not ready. They can't be ready. No country on this planet could be ready, because they have to identify where they're going to vaccinate, who they're going to vaccinate, which health workers are going to do what, and how do you take those health workers from whatever they're doing. So there's all that nitty-gritty stuff that needs to be worked through. And if you're suddenly told, hey, tomorrow you know you're getting 300 million doses or something,
Right.
you're not going to be able to do it. And then you're faced with this awful situation where you've got stacks of vaccine on the tarmac and not even enough space in your warehouse, and not even, you know, not an adequate cold chain to make it happen. So all those things, our first problem was supply. Now it is sightline and management and knowing what we're going to get and when we're going to get, and also now getting a bit more granular with the countries that are struggling. So we've now providing teams and identifying the countries that have got very specific issues and sending teams to work with them to try to fix those issues. So things are getting better.
Good.
But they're not, they're much better. I mean, we've seen such an acceleration in the last month. I think we've delivered more vaccine in the last couple of months than we did in the whole of the rest of 2021. So things are certainly a great deal better. And now the challenge will be at country level, making sure that what comes in can be used effectively.
So that is such a good overview. I want to jump back to you, Akin. I know there were a fair number of vaccine doses in Nigeria that did expire. And so I'm wondering, when you look at that situation, say you do get 3 million doses tomorrow, do you feel like the country's ready to distribute that? What do you think a country like Nigeria needs to really do a successful wide-scale vaccination program? And as I remember, the vaccination rate in Nigeria is still fairly low at this point.
Yeah. You know, before the vaccine, logistics need to be in place. There has to be some form of preparedness. If I know something is coming towards me, I need to prepare. What are the things I need to do? Who are the people to train? And not that the product will come tomorrow and I start thinking about it. And the other thing we also need to look at is we have routine immunization. How far have we gone, you know, in most African countries? And Nigeria did well when it comes to polio eradication. There were challenges, and there were challenges to the sense that even taking the vaccine to the field in itself, that is one step. Administering the vaccine, that's another step. In a way that at the end of the day, we have people who had no business in vaccination, you know, being brought in a way that we can enhance, you know, what was being done. You look at imams, you look at religious leaders, both the Christian and Muslims. You have to go to churches, mosques, and so on and so forth, so that people can, you know, be receptive, you know, to the product. People can be receptive, you know, to vaccination in itself. So it's one thing for us to have donation, but preparedness, you know, when there is a crisis. You know, we had, you know, a number of countries had some time before COVID came, to their country. But were we really prepared in terms of putting steps in a way that we can prevent, influx, of people who are infected? Did we apply the public health, protocol in a way that it can address the issues we had? And do we critique, what is going on, as media, as journalists, that this and this and this, are the things going on? Because a lot of the time when issues come, when pandemic comes, most of us learn it from ground zero. You don't know much about it. Scientists are working to understand what is going on. But for COVID was brought to the marketplace where everybody had a say. And it's not, synonymous with the way science works. Science works in the laboratory for quite some time before they have a finding that they can share with colleagues and so on and so forth. But COVID was something that, at every point in time, there is information that needs to, that needs to be passed on. So now that we've realized some of the mistakes we've had in the past, new supplies are coming. Are we ramping up, the way we are going to administer, the distribution, the storage, and so on and so forth? Vaccine logistics is very, very essential for us to really look at, so that when we eventually have the product, we know what to do. 2% is too low. Most African countries, the vaccination rate, the level is very low, but COVID is still with us, and it has affected most of us, either directly or indirectly. So preparation is very important at every stage, not just the vaccine, but the system that we have. How is our vaccine logistic working? How does the public health system works? Our health workers, are they prepared, to do the needful? And all those things need someone to think far ahead before crisis comes.
And do you see that in Egypt, Mohammed? The government is putting into place systems to better distribute vaccines out of the cities and around the country? Or do you think additional resources or help would be needed in that regard?
I think that the government, in Egypt, it already had a good structure in place. So recently we had a very successful hepatitis C campaign, for example, and hepatitis C still is a huge issue in Egypt. So the structure is in place, but the problem that Margaret pointed out, that the vaccines are all coming in now at the same time. So we keep hearing of all these millions of doses that are coming in. And it's exactly that. This has all started in the past 2 or 3 months or so when those doses came in. And it's a strain on the system to be able to find that many people who can vaccinate in all parts of the country. And on the other hand, there is a problem of communication on the importance of vaccination. And I think Omicron has made that particularly worse, because a lot of the communication in the media has been about, the way Omicron has been covered in the media has mostly focused on it being much milder than Delta, and people are not getting that serious symptoms anymore. There's a lot of joking about it even in the media, and I think that has blunted the effect of it. So people are less keen to take the vaccines. They're looking at this as something that's just not that serious anymore. Why should they get a vaccine? Why should they bother about going for that? So even when, it's a challenge to get these vaccines out, especially vaccines that require a cold chain. But even when they do reach these different places, it's a challenge to convince people to come in and take those vaccines, because there's been such poor communication, I think. And while I think there's been a lot of transparency with announcing numbers of new infections every day, deaths. I mean, those are available on a daily basis from the health ministry, but at the same time, there's a lack of testing. So these numbers are not that accurate, and people are not seeing the real picture. I mean, if going by the numbers, then it's I would guess that every single person infected is someone I know, judging from how many people around me are sick at this point. So while these numbers, I mean, while I appreciate that these numbers are being made available, I think there needs to be more context behind them, and that's what's lacking. I mean, just getting numbers of daily infections, while it is good for transparency, I don't think it helps people on the ground. You need to see some kind of analysis of those numbers, the trends, how are things changing, how are vaccines helping. These kind of issues are not really communicated. There's no communication on the importance of vaccines. There's no communication on how vaccines can reduce the number of serious symptoms and deaths so drastically, while you get coverage for other issues that can be quite negative, let's say. So, for example, when some very rare side effects of the AstraZeneca vaccines came up, that was all over the news. But there was no analysis to put that in context of the bigger picture compared to how many people have taken that vaccine around the world and how many lives it has saved. This was not seen. The whole focus was on these number of cases that had serious side effects from taking the vaccine. So there's a communication problem that's impending distribution as well.
Amy, what is the responsibility of science journalists in this situation? I mean, I know that you've written quite a bit about inequitable distribution of both treatments and vaccines in the United States and around the world. Have we contributed to the problem at the end of this, right? So have we, I mean, if you're a journalist who believes that equitable distribution of vaccines and actually receptivity to them is important, what is our responsibility in this situation?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important for journalists to hold their own governments to account always. So, and to be clear, I feel like all of the issues that, everybody's talked about with misinformation and also how the media will blow up anything for a click, sometimes it seems like, and which has been pretty disastrous. Supply still is an issue, to be clear. So, for example, in Nigeria, where there's 2% of people who are fully vaccinated, that's not because there's enough vaccines for everyone to get 2 doses and a booster and just nobody wants them. I mean, so it's all true. There's a lack of logistics in place, but there's also a huge lack of supplies. And especially now that we've seen Omicron, which means that maybe we have to update vaccines, that we see that boosters are hugely effective. Some people are saying this is now a 3-dose vaccine. We do need more supply. So where I'm sitting in the US, I mean, part of what I'm thinking about is like, let's just call it what it is. Why are we not making more vaccines, especially, the mRNA vaccines that we know are highly effective, which we have right now, which are approved, which we have here in the US, but which many countries don't have. I think a huge number of low and middle income countries receives mainly China's vaccines, which are inactivated virus from Sinopharm. But those may not be that effective against Omicron at all. So we definitely have supply issues. And so from where I'm sitting, I want to know, why do we have this suddenly let's dump all of our doses near expiry to another country and call that a donation? That's not a system. There needs to be enough of a steady supply so that countries get it just as we have gotten vaccines in enough time. And why isn't there manufacturing in low and middle income countries? India has a huge, India produces most of the vaccines for the developing world. So why is that not producing more? Why are there, why after like 70 years of, aid post-colonization, are there not more vaccine, biotech and manufacturing plants on the African continent? I think those are all questions we should really be asking ourselves right now. And to, like I said, I hold my own. I think there's a case for everyone to hold their own governments to account. Holding my own government to account, why are we not pushing on that more? I think the Biden administration supported a waiver on patents on vaccines, but we haven't really heard anything about that since then. And there also has to be, the governments could be doing more to tell pharmaceutical companies that, right now, Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and Moderna are all U.S. companies. A lot of them got Moderna especially, and Johnson & Johnson got so much U.S. taxpayer money to develop these vaccines. Why is the government not doing more to say we need to license these vaccines out to additional manufacturers so they can make more vaccines, and those vaccines can be at lower cost? So that's where I stand as a U.S. journalist.
Gee, I hate to say it, but I agree with everything you just said. So, Josh, I wonder if you could follow up on that. I know you were critical early of the equitable vaccine distribution and whether it had worked or not. Are you more optimistic now? Do you see actual productive conversations on finding better ways to give the logistical support or encouraging production in countries in the global south?
Yeah, certainly the issues that Amy raises and others have raised, are significant. And it's clear that whereas last year the just overarching and most prominent weakness in the system was a lack of supply, 2021, the story was a lack of supply. 2022 might be a little bit of a different story, in that supply has increased, as we've heard, especially in the last few months. And we have new vaccines coming on board now, the protein subunit vaccines from Novavax and the biological E, and supply increasing. So clearly it's going to be a challenge to meet the demands that we have. As Amy referenced, there is likely to be a growing demand, not just to meet the 2-dose requirement for a primary series of these vaccines, but a 3-dose, meaning including a booster dose. And we're seeing, expert groups come out and recommend that this be standard practice. We're seeing expansion of recommendations to include adolescents and children now as well. And so this is not just for select countries, this is for every country, and especially given the threat of Omicron and perhaps future variants that have some immune evasion, this idea of 3 doses rather than 2 is going to become critical, I think, and have implications for supply. So we're not out of the woods on the supply side, but the challenge is more complex because now we have to pay attention more to the distribution side and the challenges that the other panelists have raised on that. We have to combat hesitancy and misinformation. And we have to make sure that countries have access to the different vaccine types that are necessary to address their epidemiological circumstances in ways that best protect their citizens. So as the epidemic and this pandemic, each country's epidemic and the pandemic in general evolve, our policies, including our vaccination policies and the mechanisms that we use to distribute these, have to evolve with them. Now, the manufacturing issues that having enough manufacturing capacity in countries, this is a major issue and will continue to be for a while. There are some slow baby steps in the process of establishing, for example, on the African continent, additional vaccine production capacity, but it is not going to be available at the scale that's necessary to address our current concerns. But it isn't critical to continue to invest in that, not just for future variants, but also just future epidemics and future pandemics, God forbid, down the road, having that capacity and addressing some of the gaps which made it so hard to get vaccines where they needed for this current pandemic.
Yeah, that's a terrific overview of where we are now. I'm going to move to excuse me, questions from the audience or the participants in this webinar. And I'm going to start with Margaret. There's a question for you from Beatrice Dacruz from France, which is the WHO at this point actively involved in logistics support? And are you saying, I'm adding on to this from Alana Gordon, that we have the supplies, we just don't have the distribution? I mean, we actually have adequate supplies, just not distribution?
Oh, that's quite a couple of good questions. We've actually been heavily involved in logistics of all kind right from the beginning. We've got an enormous logistics team that have been distributing, before we had vaccines, they were distributing PPE, tests, oxygen, all the things that countries have been desperately in need of from the beginning. And of course, we don't do all the logistics for the vaccines for COVAX. That's mostly managed by UNICEF, who have a superb, I'm sure you know, vaccine distribution system that they've been using for distribution of vaccines for routine immunization, for childhood immunization. Your second question about supply, I was saying the supply is improved. I didn't say we're out of the woods.
Okay.
We are much happier with what we're getting, but it's not like, oh yes, we can sit back. What I'm saying is, now that the supply is coming in, we have to also ensure that countries get good advance warning and are ready to use every vaccine they get. And of course, that they're getting vaccines they want, vaccines that are appropriate for their circumstances. And I think it was mentioned by my colleague from Nigeria that the healthcare workers are trained, ready and available to do the vaccinating, and that you can find all the people that you need to vaccinate and make sure you do it.
Sounds great. Akin, I have a question directly to you from Fatila Sarudin, which is, how brave are African journalists in actually taking on government bureaucracy in hoarding vaccines? If the government is indeed hoarding vaccines, and is there actually adequate investigative reporting in Africa on the private sales of vaccines or the failure to distribute vaccines to more vulnerable people?
The answer is yes. We have well-trained journalists. Remember, in Nigeria, we chased out a dictator. We more or less helped Nigeria to come back into democracy. You know, you remember we had Abacha, General Abacha of those days. And when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to other areas of the economy in Nigeria, we have well-rounded journalists who can hold government accountable. I can tell you a story about an African government that came, president that came to Nigeria and was complaining that the media was not writing good stories about him. And the president then, I think probably former President Obasanjo, brought out a newspaper, that's this newspaper, and showed, look at what they've written about me also. So we have journalists who are well trained, who are investigative. I mean, we have a lot of investigative journalism, training that has taken place, all over Nigeria now. And the government is being held accountable, both at the state, local government, and the federal level. And these are some of the things that, we've done, in this part of.
That sounds impressive, actually. And I'm going to completely pivot to the question of medication. I mean, we've had a good bit of discussion about equitable production and distribution of vaccines, but there are also some high-end and elegant medicines that are being approved in Western states. I'm thinking of the new antivirals from Merck and Pfizer, for instance. Do we anticipate a similar problem with equitable distributions of medications to treat COVID? This is one of the questions from the chat. Are there concerns about that already, or steps being taken to address that? Josh, do you want to take that on?
Sure, I can start to answer that. Yeah, these are potentially very important tools. The Merck and Pfizer pills are given to people who have been infected, within 3 to 5 days after becoming infected, and show some effectiveness at preventing development of severe disease and death. And particularly the Pfizer pill has shown an even higher effectiveness at preventing that. But we're in a similar situation with the vaccines. Early on, we were with the same situation we were with the vaccines, in that there's a very limited supply at the moment. There are reasons to be concerned that we will be repeating the experience with the vaccines, but also some reasons for optimism. And the concerns are that given the extremely limited number of doses that are out there, what we're already seeing is a repeat of this phenomenon with the high-income countries or the higher-income countries snapping up the available supply. So, it's been reported that the initial supply out through April, for example, has been almost completely, if not completely, purchased already by the countries which you might expect would be up at the front of the line. Whereas doses that are coming further, later in the year, there might be some availability to other countries. It's still going to be a concern that we repeat this issue. But the source for optimism is that in contrast to the vaccine manufacturers earlier on, the Merck and Pfizer have both worked with global health authorities, the Medicines Patent Pool, WHO, and others to try and make this more available by partnering, or allowing generic manufacturers to develop these vaccines. So, 30 generic manufacturers are already on board, from what I've read, to make the Merck pill, and a number of them are already on board to make the Pfizer pill. It's just going to take a long time for those to get going. But even so, a course of the Merck pill, 40 pills for 5 days, may still cost around $20, even in the case of a generic manufacturer, which, is a cost consideration when you're thinking about how to spend limited resources. How accessible will that be? So that's another concern. And then just a sort of biological concern, both of these pills are monotherapies, antiviral pills, which if given alone, we are worried about the potential for resistance to develop to these pills, which could, of course, be very, very problematic. So we'll have to keep tabs on that, making sure that they are used effectively, and they have to be paired with testing, because you have to know you're infected in the first place, and that's another concern here. So lots to look at when it comes to the rollout and the use of these antiviral medications, for sure.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that? I'm wondering and we're just about out of time, so if you have a quick perspective on that. I wish we could get to all the questions that are in the chat. But I wonder specifically, Mohammed, you mentioned once knowing someone who went to the hospital with COVID symptoms and who was given antihistamines. Do you feel that there is equitable distribution of good treatments for COVID in your country?
Well, I think, if anything, the most glaring thing we can see out of this whole pandemic is the inequity problem, and it has extended in every step of this. So in early 2020, it was personal protective equipment. There was not enough, and more developed countries were getting large supplies, and poorer countries were left out. And when that when production was ramped up, that's when countries in the global south started receiving these. And then the same happened with vaccines, and I imagine the same will be happening with the medication pills. And the problem is that in each of these steps, this inequity has created disasters, right? So the rise of new variants was due to rampant infections. And when you do not have medication available, doctors will just resort to whatever they can. And here in Egypt, I mean, there's these cocktails that people prescribe for COVID, and it's a disaster because they have horrible side effects. Everything ranging from ivermectin to hydroxychloroquine, antihistamines, all along that spectrum. And there are so many people taking these medications now in extremely high doses, and I fear about the effect that this would have in the future when you have so many people being treated in this way because of the lack of the actual tested treatments. Because again, like Josh was pointing out, they will not probably be available in the global south. I mean, best speculation near the end of the year, to be honest.
Yes, I think that's a very realistic summary of where we are. And we're unfortunately out of time. I wish I have so many more questions to ask you, and I wish we could do this another hour, but I'd like to thank all of you for, your very clear and thoughtful discussion of these issues today. And with that, I will hand it back to Mallory.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you to all of you for this enlightening discussion. Really, really appreciate it. And as we close out this webinar, I want to give a huge thanks to all of our speakers who joined from around the world today. Your global perspectives and your expert knowledge have been truly helpful. So thank you. And I hope those of you who have been joining us today have come away with a deeper understanding of the topics that we've discussed and with ideas about how to improve and enhance your COVID-19 coverage. I want to give a huge thanks to our partners and sponsors who made today's webinar possible. This webinar was organized by the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas at the University of Texas at Austin, in partnership with UNESCO and with funding from the World Health Organization and UNESCO's multi-donor program on freedom of expression and safety of journalists. This webinar was a huge team effort, as you can imagine, and so I want to thank everyone who helped out behind the scenes, including the Knight Center staff, our moderator, Deborah Blum, the Moody College tech team, the Veritas group, and Stephen Mines and his team of interpreters. So thank you to everyone, including those who I didn't mention. This was wonderful to work with all of you. And today's webinar, I want to mention, is one of many COVID-19 events that we've held for journalists, and more offerings will soon be available on the Knight Center's journalismcourses.org site, including a robust COVID-19 resource hub that we'll be offering in partnership with UNESCO and with funding from the European Union. The hub will feature a variety of resources for journalists and media practitioners, including online courses, regional COVID-19 briefings, and recordings of today's webinar. With that, I will close out the webinar and once again say thank you so much for being with us here today. Stay safe and take care.